Welcome back, background historian crew. Tonight we will dive deep into a fascinating and terrifying section of history. Punishments across history and civilizations have spanned from humane and reasonable to some of the most gruesome and inhumane acts we can see. We will be delving into how different countries, civilizations, and peoples treated criminals and the various ways they carried out justice. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and perhaps a loved one to get you through this episode. Part 1: Justice in Ancient Mesopotamia. Introduction: A land between rivers. Imagine yourself standing along the banks of the great Euphrates River nearly 4,000 years ago. The land is fertile but fragile, crisscrossed with canals and irrigation ditches, its soil heavy with the labor of countless farmers. This is Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, where some of the world's earliest cities rose and fell, and where justice itself began to take a form that would shape societies for millennia. In this land of Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, law was more than a practical tool. It was divine, linked to the gods themselves. To speak of punishment here is to speak of order, cosmic order, political order, and social order. The birth of written law. Before Mesopotamia, justice was often a matter of personal vengeance. Families avenged wrongs, and chiefs or tribal elders decided disputes based on memory and custom. But in Mesopotamia, with its growing cities and complex economies, this was no longer enough. The earliest written codes, such as the Sumerian Code of Ur-Nammu, around 2100 BCE, set forth specific punishments for specific offenses. They were not vague guidelines, they were etched into clay tablets for all to see. If a man caused harm to another, the consequence was written. If a dispute arose over land, the resolution was codified. These early codes reflected a new idea, that law should be public and permanent. No longer did justice depend solely on the whim of rulers or elders. Law became something stable, an authority that outlasted any single individual. The Code of Hammurabi. Of all Mesopotamian contributions to justice, none is more famous than the Code of Hammurabi, circa 1754 BCE. Inscribed on a tall black basalt stele, the code contained nearly 300 laws. At the top, the king himself is depicted receiving authority from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. The message was clear: laws were divine in origin, but earthly in enforcement. Among the laws: if a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. The principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye. If a builder builds a house and it collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. If a man steals from a temple or palace, he shall be put to death. Yet the code was not purely harsh. It also regulated wages, prices, and contracts. It protected widows and orphans, and it even sought to limit vengeance by prescribing exact punishments rather than leaving justice to endless cycles of retaliation. Punishment as a reflection of social class. In Mesopotamia, not all were equal before the law. Punishment depended on status. A noble, a commoner, and a slave might receive different outcomes for the same crime. For example, if a nobleman injured another noble, the punishment might be equal retaliation. If a nobleman injured a commoner, he might only pay a fine. If the victim was a slave, the penalty was often monetary compensation to the slave's owner. This inequality reminds us that justice was not an abstract universal, it was deeply tied to maintaining the social hierarchy. Rituals of justice. Punishment in Mesopotamia was not always a matter of brute force. It was often theatrical, carried out in public to reinforce the presence of order. A thief might be executed before a crowd. An adulterer might be drowned in a river, the outcome left to the gods' judgment. Trial by ordeal was sometimes used. For example, if a person was accused of sorcery or betrayal but evidence was lacking, they might be thrown into a river. Survival meant innocence, for the gods themselves had chosen. In these acts, punishment became a stage where human authority and divine will merged. A fictional glimpse, the potter's trial. Picture now a man named Enlillahu, a potter in Babylon. One day, a customer accuses him of cheating, selling a vessel that leaked water. The case is brought before the local judge. The judge consults Hammurabi's code. A craftsman who causes harm through negligence must bear the cost. Enlillahu is fined, forced to pay in grain. He bows his head in shame, for the penalty is not only financial but social. Word spreads through the marketplace, and his reputation suffers. Through Enlilahu's story, we glimpse how punishment was not always about death or mutilation. It was about restoring balance, ensuring the community continued in harmony. Law as cosmic order. At the heart of Mesopotamian punishment was the idea of order. To the Babylonians, the universe itself was fragile, always threatened by chaos. Just as the rivers could flood unpredictably or dry up in drought, so too could human society collapse if not carefully managed. Law, then, was a tool to keep chaos at bay. Punishment was not merely retribution, it was a ritual act of restoring cosmic balance. Transition toward later traditions. The legacy of Mesopotamian justice spread far beyond the Tigris and Euphrates. Hammurabi's principles influenced later Hebrew law, which in turn shaped Greek and Roman traditions. Even today, echoes of an eye for an eye linger in debates about fairness and punishment. Closing reflection. As you drift into sleep, imagine the stone stele of Hammurabi standing tall in the Babylonian sun. Citizens gather, pointing to its inscriptions, debating the fairness of its decrees. Judges read its words by torchlight. Families whisper of its penalties by the hearth. Though thousands of years have passed, the human desire for justice, for order, for fairness, for a way to right what is wrong, remains much the same. Here, in the cradle of civilization, punishment was not merely a tool of power. It was a symbol of the human struggle to live together in harmony under the watchful eyes of the gods. Part 2, Egypt's Balance of Ma'at. Introduction, the Nile and the Rhythm of Order. Picture the Nile River at dawn, its waters glistening in the rising sun. The land around it is rich, green, and fertile, bordered by deserts that stretch endlessly beyond the horizon. This is ancient Egypt, a civilization whose lifeblood pulsed with the regular flooding of the river. Just as the Nile brought balance between chaos and fertility, Egyptian justice was bound to the concept of Ma'at, the cosmic order that governed the universe. To understand Egyptian punishments is to understand this delicate balance. Justice was not simply about punishing wrongs. It was about maintaining Ma'at, truth, harmony, and equilibrium. Ma'at, the foundation of Egyptian justice. At the core of Egyptian society was Ma'at, represented as a goddess with an ostrich feather on her head. She symbolized truth, order, and balance. Every pharaoh, from Narmer to Cleopatra, was seen as the guardian of Ma'at, tasked with keeping the world from slipping into Isfet, chaos. Laws, punishments, and trials were therefore extensions of cosmic balance. To commit a crime was to disturb Ma'at, and punishment was not merely revenge but restoration. Everyday justice, local courts and viziers. Unlike Mesopotamia, Egypt did not produce one famous unified code like Hammurabi's. Instead, justice was carried out by local courts, village elders, and ultimately the vizier, the pharaoh's chief minister, who was called the priest of Ma'at. In villages, disputes over land, theft, or trade were often handled by councils of elders. For more serious cases, murder, treason, or temple theft, the vizier or even the pharaoh himself might be involved. Types of punishments. Egyptian punishments varied depending on the crime and the social standing of the criminal. Like Mesopotamia, Egypt's justice system was not equal across classes. Fines and confiscation. For lesser crimes like minor theft, fines were common. Sometimes property was confiscated as repayment. Beatings and flogging. The rod was a frequent tool of punishment. Criminals, debtors, and even workers accused of laziness could be whipped. Forced labor. Convicts were sometimes condemned to work in quarries or mines, conditions so brutal they were nearly a death sentence. Mutilation. For crimes against the state, thieves and traitors might have their noses or ears cut off. This not only punished but marked them for life. Death penalty. Reserved for the gravest offenses: murder, tomb robbery, treason. Execution methods included burning, drowning, decapitation, or impalement. Yet compared to other civilizations, Egypt did not appear excessively cruel. The emphasis was always on restoring balance rather than indulging in brutality for its own sake. The case of the tomb robbers. One of the most famous glimpses into Egyptian punishment comes from the tomb robbery papyri of the 20th dynasty, around 1100 BCE. During this period, Egypt was in decline, and even the sacred tombs of the pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings were being plundered. The papyri record trials where gangs of workers, often impoverished and desperate, confessed under interrogation to looting treasures. The punishments were severe: execution, mutilation, or forced labor in distant quarries. Here, punishment was not just about theft, it was sacrilege. To disturb a tomb was to offend the gods, and thus punishment had to restore not only social order but cosmic reverence. Trial by ordeal and oaths to the gods. Egyptian trials sometimes relied on divine judgment. If evidence was lacking, the accused might swear an oath before the gods. Breaking such an oath was believed to invite divine retribution, perhaps even in the afterlife. Occasionally, ordeals were used. A suspected liar might be forced to drink water blessed by priests. If illness followed, the gods had judged them guilty. Punishment and the afterlife. Egyptian beliefs about punishment extended far beyond earthly life. The ultimate judgment came after death, when a person's heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was heavier, laden with sin, it was devoured by Ammit, the crocodile-headed monster, and the soul ceased to exist. Thus, Egyptians lived with two systems of justice: the earthly courts of viziers and pharaohs, and the eternal judgment of Osiris in the afterlife. A fictional glimpse: the weaver of Thebes. Imagine a woman named Nefret, a weaver in Thebes, accused of stealing cloth from her workshop. She stands before a local council, trembling. Witnesses argue. She swears an oath to Isis, proclaiming her innocence. If she is found guilty, she might be flogged publicly, her family shamed. If she escapes earthly punishment but has lied under oath, she risks eternal annihilation in the hall of Osiris. The thought of her heart being devoured in the afterlife is far more terrifying than any earthly lash of the rod. Public theater of justice. Like Mesopotamia, Egyptian punishments were often public. Executions or beatings served as warnings. Criminals condemned to forced labor were marched away in chains, their fates well known. This theater was part of the lesson: justice was not private, but communal. Everyone saw the restoration of Ma'at, and everyone was reminded of the cost of disrupting it. Legacy of Egyptian punishment. Egypt's system of punishment left a legacy that went beyond its borders. The idea that justice was tied to cosmic balance influenced Hebrew traditions and, through them, much of Western thought. The weighing of the heart, the judgment of the soul, would echo in later religions as the weighing of deeds before God. Closing reflection. As you drift towards sleep, picture the temple courts of Thebes, lit by torches, where priests and officials speak in hushed tones. Outside, crowds gather, watching as judgment is handed down. And beyond it all, the Nile flows, steady and eternal, just as Ma'at endures. To the Egyptians, punishment was not merely an act of cruelty or vengeance. It was an act of balance, a reaffirmation that the universe was still ordered, still whole. Part 3: Greece and the Theater of Justice. Introduction: the polis and the public eye. Now we sail across the Mediterranean, from the fertile Nile Valley to the rocky hills of Greece. Picture the marble columns of Athens gleaming in the sun, the agora filled with voices debating politics, philosophy, and commerce. In this land of democracy and theater, justice itself was a performance, public, dramatic, and deeply tied to the identity of the polis, the city-state. Unlike Egypt, where cosmic balance guided punishment, Greek justice was about citizenship, community, and reputation. Crimes were not merely violations of law but affronts to the collective order of the city. The birth of law in Greece. Early Greek laws were harsh and unwritten, remembered through tradition. The term draconian comes from Draco, an Athenian lawmaker of the 7th century BCE, whose punishments were famously severe. Theft, death, insolence, death. Almost every crime carried the same penalty. But over time, Greek law evolved. Solon, another lawgiver, softened these harsh measures and introduced written codes. With the rise of democracy in Athens, trials became communal affairs, where ordinary citizens, jurors, decided the fates of their peers. Courts as theater. Greek courts were enormous compared to modern ones. Some trials in Athens might draw hundreds of jurors, chosen by lot. Speeches were timed by water clocks, and litigants often hired logographers, speechwriters like Lysias, to craft persuasive arguments. Punishment, therefore, began long before sentencing. It unfolded as a spectacle of rhetoric, reputation, and persuasion. To lose a trial was not only to suffer a penalty but to suffer shame, visible to all. Common punishments in Greece. The Greeks, like their neighbors, had a range of punishments, but they preferred those that carried civic weight. Fines, the most common punishment, especially for the wealthy. Atimia, loss of rights, a uniquely Greek penalty. Stripped of the rights of citizenship, an atomos could no longer vote, speak in the assembly, or participate in civic life. Exile, a penalty worse than death for some. Exile cut a person off from their polis. Ostracism, a public vote to expel a citizen for 10 years, was used not for crimes but to curb dangerous ambition. Death penalty, reserved for treason, murder, or impiety. Execution methods included drinking hemlock, stoning, or public exposure. The case of Socrates. Perhaps the most famous Greek punishment was the execution of Socrates in 399 BCE. Accused of corrupting the youth and impiety against the gods, Socrates was tried by a jury of 500 citizens. Despite his brilliant defense, he was sentenced to death. Offered exile, he refused, choosing instead to drink the cup of hemlock. His calm acceptance of the penalty turned his death into a philosophical statement: the individual must accept the judgment of the polis, even if unjust. Everyday justice and lesser crimes. Not all Greek punishments were so grand. Thieves could be flogged, debtors enslaved. Slaves were punished brutally, beatings, branding, or crucifixion. Free citizens, however, were spared such humiliations. Their punishments were crafted to cut at their civic standing. Punishment in Sparta. While Athens emphasized rhetoric and theater, Sparta saw justice as discipline. In this militaristic society, punishments were designed to maintain order and obedience. Helots, enslaved people, could be executed without trial if suspected of rebellion. Spartan boys in training were beaten not for stealing but for being caught. Cunning was prized, carelessness punished. Cowardice in battle was perhaps the worst crime. A man branded a coward might be forced to wear shameful clothing, excluded from communal meals, and scorned by all. Here, punishment reinforced military discipline and collective identity. Trial by reputation. In Greece, punishment often extended beyond the courtroom. Reputation was everything. A citizen shamed in court might find his political career ruined, his family tainted. For women, already excluded from citizenship, shame was even harsher, affecting marriage prospects and household honor. A fictional glimpse, the merchant of Athens. Imagine a merchant named Cleon, accused of cheating customers by using false weights. He stands before hundreds of jurors, his rival delivering a fiery speech. The jurors murmur, the water clock drips away. If convicted, Cleon may face a heavy fine. But worse than the fine is the shame, neighbors whispering, customers vanishing, his sons ridiculed in the agora. Even if he pays his debt, his reputation may never recover. Religion and punishment. Greek justice was deeply entwined with religion. Crimes like sacrilege, temple robbery, or impiety carried the severest punishments. The trial of Socrates is the clearest example, but countless others were punished for offending the gods. In some cases, entire families were cursed or exiled for sacrilegious acts, reflecting the belief that divine wrath could fall upon bloodlines. Public spectacle and the community's role. As in Egypt and Mesopotamia, Greek punishments were often public. Executions, exiles, even the announcement of fines were meant to teach lessons. But uniquely, Greek justice depended on mass participation. Hundreds of jurors, thousands of voters, and the ever-watchful eye of neighbors ensured that punishment was a communal affair. Legacy of Greek punishment. The Greek approach to justice, public, rhetorical, and civic, shaped Western legal traditions. The idea of trial by jury, the connection between law and citizenship, and the balance between rights and responsibilities all descend from Greece. And yet, their punishments remind us that democracy does not always mean mercy. Socrates, condemned by a democratic jury, is the eternal lesson that the voice of the people can still be harsh. Closing reflection. As you settle into rest, picture the agora at dusk, the marble courts echoing with voices, the water clock dripping steadily as speeches rise and fall. See Socrates, calm and steady, lifting the cup of hemlock to his lips. In Greece, punishment was never just about crime. It was about who belonged to the polis, who was worthy of citizenship, and how the city preserved its fragile balance between freedom and order. Part 4, Rome and the Empire of Law. Introduction, the weight of the empire. Close your eyes and picture the Roman world. Roads stretch across continents, aqueducts carry water into bustling cities, and the Colosseum towers over the eternal city, promising both entertainment and dread. Rome was not merely a city but an empire, and with empire came order. Laws governed every corner, from Britain to Mesopotamia, and punishments became the instruments that bound this vast realm together. Roman justice was at once sophisticated and brutal. It laid the groundwork for modern legal codes, yet its punishments could be spectacles of unimaginable cruelty. Rome fused law with theater, discipline with dominance, and punishment with power. The foundations of Roman law. Roman law grew steadily from the 12 tables of 450 BCE, the first written code. These laws were carved into bronze tablets, ensuring that all citizens knew their rights and obligations. Over centuries, the law expanded into a detailed, intricate system that shaped Europe long after Rome's fall. But behind the elegance of Roman law lay the harsh reality. Punishments were meant to deter, to display power, and to remind both citizen and slave of Rome's supremacy. Punishments for citizens versus non-citizens. One of Rome's defining features was the distinction between citizens and non-citizens. A Roman citizen, especially one of status, enjoyed protections that others did not. Citizens, often fined, exiled, or executed in dignified ways like beheading. Non-citizens and slaves faced scourging, crucifixion, or death in the arena. The law was not equal for all, and punishment reflected one's place in the hierarchy. Crucifixion, Rome's most infamous punishment. Crucifixion was the ultimate penalty for slaves, rebels, and criminals. It was deliberately cruel, slow, humiliating, and public. Victims were nailed or tied to wooden crosses, left to hang for days until death came through exhaustion, suffocation, or thirst. The message was clear: defy Rome, and your body would become a warning to all who passed. The crucifixion of thousands of followers of Spartacus after the slave revolt of 73 to 71 BCE lined the Appian Way for miles, each body a grim testament to Rome's dominance. The gladiatorial arena, punishment as entertainment. Nowhere was Roman punishment more spectacular than in the amphitheater. The Colosseum, with seating for over 50,000, staged executions alongside gladiatorial combat. Criminals condemned to the beasts faced lions, leopards, or bears. Others reenacted myths, dying in elaborate performances staged for the crowd's delight. This was justice as spectacle, an empire that transformed punishment into a shared ritual of control and entertainment. The carcer and prison sentences. Interestingly, Rome did not favor long-term imprisonment as a punishment. Prisons, like the infamous Tullianum in Rome, were holding places before trial or execution. Punishments were meant to be swift and decisive, not prolonged behind bars. Corporal punishments. For lesser crimes, corporal punishments were common. Flogging with whips, flagrum, embedded with bone or metal. Branding criminals on the forehead with letters denoting their crime. Amputation for theft in certain provinces. These punishments marked offenders permanently, ensuring their shame followed them everywhere. Political crimes and treason. For elites, the greatest crime was treason. Senators, generals, or governors who defied the emperor could face exile, confiscation of property, or execution. Sometimes, dignified suicide was permitted, allowing the accused to avoid public humiliation while protecting family property. The philosopher Seneca, accused of conspiracy against Emperor Nero, famously slit his wrists in a stoic acceptance of fate, turning punishment into philosophical performance. Religious punishments. Rome was pragmatic with religion, often absorbing local gods. But when religion threatened imperial order, punishment was swift. Early Christians, refusing to sacrifice to Roman gods, were seen as defiant. Many were executed in the arenas, their deaths both punishment and deterrent. The martyrdom of figures like Saint Perpetua and Saint Felicity in Carthage became enduring tales of faith against Rome's iron will. Military discipline. Rome's armies were disciplined through brutal punishments. Soldiers who deserted or disobeyed faced flogging, execution, or the dreaded decimation, where every 10th man in a disgraced unit was executed by his comrades. This maintained fear and cohesion, ensuring Rome's legions remained the most formidable force of their age. Daily justice and lesser crimes. For ordinary Romans, punishments could be mundane yet harsh. Debt slavery bound those who failed to repay creditors. Exile to remote islands was common for poets, philosophers, and politicians deemed troublesome. Ovid, exiled to the Black Sea, lamented his punishment in poetry. Public humiliation, such as parading offenders in chains, was a staple of civic justice. A fictional glimpse, the baker of Rome. Imagine a baker named Marcus, caught selling bread made with chalk instead of flour. Hauled before the magistrate, he faces the wrath of hungry citizens. His punishment. Public flogging in the marketplace, his bakery confiscated, his name forever associated with fraud. For Marcus, the whip's sting is temporary, but the shame will last generations. The legacy of Roman punishment. Rome left two legacies, law and spectacle. On one hand, their legal principles of contracts, property, and citizenship endure in modern systems. On the other, their brutal spectacles remind us how power often used punishment as theater, binding society through fear. Even today, the word Roman conjures images of both legal genius and crucifixions, of order and terror intertwined. Closing reflection. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the roar of the Colosseum, the clash of gladiators, the fearful silence as a prisoner is dragged before the beasts. Then shift to the quiet dignity of a Roman court, where the law is read aloud and the fate of a man is sealed by the magistrate's word. Rome, the empire of law, ensured that punishment was not only about crime, it was about reminding everyone, from senator to slave, of the power of the state. Part 5, The Shadows of the Middle Ages. Introduction, The Cloak of Darkness. The Roman Empire had fallen, its roads fractured, its aqueducts crumbling. Across Europe, kingdoms rose and fell like shifting sands. This was the Middle Ages, a time that many later historians would describe as dark, though in truth it was an age of both hardship and innovation. Amid the castles, cathedrals, and plagues, one feature of medieval life remained inescapable, the punishments that enforced order. Where Rome had blended law with spectacle, the Middle Ages blended punishment with both religion and fear of the unknown. The Church guided moral order, monarchs wielded absolute power, and peasants lived under systems that demanded obedience through discipline. Justice often came wrapped in ritual, superstition, and brutality. The Church and the Sword. The Church was the great power of medieval Europe, but secular rulers also held sway. Sometimes they worked together, other times they clashed. Yet both agreed on one principle: sin and crime must be punished, not only to protect society, but also to save the soul. Punishments could therefore be both spiritual and physical. Confession and penance alongside whips and chains. A thief might be forced to fast, but also lose a hand. A heretic might be sentenced to prayer, or to flames. Trial by ordeal. One of the most distinctive punishments of this age was the ordeal. Instead of relying on evidence, guilt was determined by God's judgment, revealed through physical trials. Ordeal by fire. The accused carried a red-hot iron a set number of paces. If their wounds healed cleanly, they were innocent; if not, guilty. Ordeal by water. The accused was bound and thrown into water. If they floated, they were guilty, rejected by the pure element. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned. Ordeal by combat. Nobles sometimes settled disputes by fighting. God was believed to grant victory to the righteous. These ordeals turned punishment into a ritual of faith, terrifying for peasants who trusted their fate to divine intervention. Corporal punishments. Public corporal punishments were everywhere. In the village square, one might see stocks and pillories, where offenders were locked by the head or limbs while villagers jeered, threw food, or spat. Whipping posts, where thieves were flogged before the crowd. Branding irons, burning letters into flesh, marking criminals for life. These punishments were not only about pain, they were about shame. Public humiliation bound communities together by reminding everyone of the rules. Execution methods. Execution remained the ultimate penalty, and the Middle Ages were inventive in its methods. Hanging, common for thieves and murderers, quick but often botched. Burning at the stake, reserved for heresy and witchcraft, a fire meant to cleanse the soul even as it destroyed the body. Beheading, a noble's death, swift and, in theory, honorable, though a dull axe could turn it into horror. Breaking on the wheel. In parts of Europe, criminals were tied to a wagon wheel and bludgeoned limb by limb until death. Each method carried meaning, symbolism, and spectacle. The fire purified, the wheel humiliated, the axe preserved honor. Punishment for heresy and witchcraft. Perhaps no punishments from the Middle Ages loom larger in our imagination than those tied to heresy and witchcraft. The Church, fearing corruption of the faithful, treated heresy as a disease. Suspected heretics might be interrogated, tortured, and burned. The Inquisition, especially from the 13th century onward, formalized these processes. For alleged witches, punishment varied by region. Some were hanged, others burned, many drowned in tests designed to prove guilt. Superstition and fear combined to make accusations deadly, often sparked by nothing more than rumor. Punishment in the manor and village. At the local level, lords enforced justice on their estates. Peasants who stole grain might be beaten or lose an ear. A tenant who broke oaths might be expelled from the land. Justice was both practical and symbolic, reminding everyone of their dependency on lord and land. Dungeons and imprisonment. While Rome avoided long-term prisons, medieval Europe slowly developed them. Castles often had dungeons, dark underground cells for holding enemies, debtors, or political prisoners. Conditions were foul: rats, chains, and damp stone. Still, imprisonment was often temporary, a step toward ransom, trial, or execution. Permanent incarceration as punishment was rare until the later medieval and early modern periods. Punishment as spectacle. Much like Rome, the Middle Ages saw punishment as spectacle. Executions drew crowds, markets paused, and sermons framed the event as moral instruction. Children watched, peasants whispered, nobles pronounced justice. To see a hanging was to be reminded of one's place. To see a burning was to feel the terror of damnation. These spectacles reinforced order more effectively than any written law. A fictional glimpse. The Miller's Daughter. Imagine a small village in 13th century England. The miller's daughter, accused of stealing flour, stands in the pillory. Her head and hands are locked, her face exposed to scorn. Children throw rotten vegetables, neighbors whisper cruel jokes. The punishment lasts hours, and when she is released, her shame lingers longer than her bruises. Though she stole to feed her family, the community's order has been preserved. The message is clear: survival must not come before obedience. The role of torture. Torture became entwined with justice, particularly in interrogations. Methods included the rack, stretching the body until joints dislocated. The strappado, suspending the victim by the wrists, tied behind the back. The iron boot, crushing the legs with wedges. Torture was not universal but was sanctioned by church and secular courts alike in cases of heresy or treason. Its purpose was not only to extract confessions but also to terrify. Punishment and the plague. The Black Death of the 14th century brought new punishments, often scapegoating minorities. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells and faced mass executions, burnings, and exile. Fear turned punishment into mass hysteria, where order was sought through violence. The noble and the peasant. The difference between noble and peasant remained stark. Nobles might be executed with ceremony, given a sword's swift stroke, or exiled. Peasants faced whips, gallows, and flames. The law was not blind, it was deeply hierarchical. The medieval mindset. For the medieval mind, punishment was never just physical. It was spiritual, social, and cosmic. Every crime disrupted God's order, and every punishment sought to restore it. Pain purified. Shame cleansed. Execution warned. Closing reflection. As you lie back, imagine the flicker of torchlight on castle walls, the sound of chains in a dungeon, the crowd gathered at the market square for justice. The Middle Ages were harsh, yet every punishment carried meaning, every spectacle taught obedience. In the silence of night, consider how justice and fear walked hand in hand, shaping 1,000 years of European life. Part 6: Punishments in the Islamic Golden Age and Beyond. Introduction: A New World of Law. While medieval Europe was grappling with ordeals, gallows, and inquisitions, a very different kind of civilization was flourishing across the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. From the 8th to the 14th century, the Islamic Golden Age became a beacon of science, art, medicine, and philosophy. Yet alongside scholarship and invention stood something equally important: justice. Justice was deeply rooted in Sharia law, a system drawn from the Quran, the Hadith, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and centuries of legal scholarship. Unlike the superstition-driven ordeals of Europe, Islamic courts sought structure and clarity, though punishments could still be harsh, public, and deeply symbolic. The foundation: Sharia law. Sharia law divided punishments into distinct categories. Hudud, fixed punishments for crimes considered against God's law, such as theft, adultery, or apostasy. Qisas, retaliation, often summed up as an eye for an eye. If someone injured or killed another, the victim or family could demand equal punishment or forgiveness in exchange for compensation. Tazir, discretionary punishments, left to the judge, qadi, to decide, ranging from fines and exile to flogging. This structure gave Islamic justice both strictness and flexibility, emphasizing not only punishment but also the chance for repentance and forgiveness. Corporal punishments, the power of flogging. One of the most recognizable punishments of the Islamic Golden Age was flogging. Thieves, adulterers, and drunkards might face dozens or even hundreds of lashes. The punishment was public, ensuring shame as well as pain. Rules governed its use: the whip should not break skin or kill, and the face and genitals were to be avoided. The symbolism was clear: discipline the body to cleanse the soul. Amputation for theft. Among the most famous Hudud punishments was amputation for theft. In practice, however, the rules for applying it were strict. The stolen goods had to exceed a certain value. They could not be taken in a time of famine. The act had to be proven beyond doubt. If applied, the right hand was severed at the wrist. While brutal, it was intended to deter theft in societies where property was vital to survival. Historical records suggest it was less common than outsiders imagined, as courts often leaned toward leniency. Stoning and adultery. For adultery, stoning, ram, was prescribed under Hudud law when 4 reliable witnesses confirmed the act, a nearly impossible standard. In reality, most cases resulted in flogging rather than execution. Still, in some instances, stoning occurred, often in public squares. The act was as much a warning to the community as it was punishment for the accused. Qisas, an eye for an eye. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Islamic justice was qisas, the law of retaliation. If one person harmed another, the victim or family had 3 choices. Demand equal retaliation, a life for a life, a wound for a wound. Accept diya, blood money, a financial compensation. Forgive outright, earning spiritual reward. This balance between vengeance, compensation, and mercy reflected a nuanced view of justice. Unlike Europe's rigid punishments, Islamic law allowed families to choose their path. Tazir, the judge's discretion. For crimes not specified in scripture, judges could issue tazir punishments. These ranged widely. Exile to a distant region. Fines or confiscation of property. Imprisonment. Whipping or public humiliation. This flexibility allowed local contexts to shape justice, adapting law to circumstance. Prisons and confinement. Though dungeons in Europe were often makeshift, the Islamic world developed more formal prisons. Caliphs built facilities where debtors, rebels, and criminals were confined. Conditions varied. Some were humane, with food and water, while others were harsh. Still, imprisonment remained secondary to corporal punishment or restitution. Punishment as public theater. Like Europe, Islamic societies made punishment a spectacle. Markets paused, crowds gathered, and punishments were framed as warnings. Yet sermons often emphasized repentance, reminding both criminal and crowd of divine mercy. A glimpse in Baghdad. Imagine Baghdad in the 10th century, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate. A thief, caught stealing jewelry, stands before a qadi. Witnesses testify, but it is revealed he stole during a famine. The judge rules against amputation, instead ordering flogging and restitution. The thief weeps, not only from pain, but from shame before his neighbors. Justice has been served, tempered by mercy. Beyond the Islamic world, influence on others. Islamic law influenced neighboring civilizations. In Spain, under Muslim rule, Christian and Jewish communities often lived under their own laws but drew from Islamic courts for arbitration. In trade hubs, merchants trusted Islamic judges for fairness. This stood in stark contrast to the ordeals of medieval Europe, offering a glimpse of a justice system that blended faith with structured legal reasoning. The Mongol invasions, a new layer of brutality. As the Islamic Golden Age waned, the Mongols swept through Asia and the Middle East in the 13th century. Their punishments reflected steppe traditions, mass executions, impalement, and crushing beneath horses. Entire cities were leveled as warnings. The collision between Mongol ferocity and Islamic legal traditions reshaped the region, blending codes of honor, retribution, and mercy into new forms. Closing reflection. As you drift to rest, imagine the bustling streets of Baghdad, the call to prayer echoing, the qadi seated in his court, balancing the scales of justice. Punishment was not always merciless, it was layered with choice, mercy, and divine accountability. The Islamic Golden Age left not only libraries, hospitals, and observatories, but also a legacy of structured justice, where punishment carried weight, but mercy carried hope. Part 7, Punishments of the Mongol and Steppe Empires. Introduction, The Thunder of Hooves. In the 13th century, the world trembled beneath the hooves of the Mongol armies. Emerging from the windswept steppes of Central Asia, Genghis Khan and his successors carved out the largest contiguous land empire in history. Their victories were not only military, but psychological, rooted in the fear of their punishments. Whereas Europe used ordeals and gallows, and the Islamic world refined legal structures, the Mongols relied on raw terror, swift justice, and iron discipline. Their punishments became legendary, remembered as warnings long after the empire itself had faded. Justice on the steppe, a harsh code. The Mongols lived by a traditional law code called the Yasa, attributed to Genghis Khan. This law emphasized loyalty, obedience, and communal survival. Treason or disobedience was punished by death. Theft, especially of horses, was unforgivable, execution awaited the guilty. Adultery was met with severe penalties, including execution in some accounts. The Yasa reinforced unity within the ranks, ensuring that betrayal or weakness would not unravel the empire. Collective punishment, the price of failure. The Mongols used a terrifying system of collective responsibility. If one soldier deserted, the entire unit might be executed. If a conquered city resisted surrender, not only soldiers but entire populations could be massacred. This bred obedience and fear. Cities learned quickly that resistance might mean annihilation, while surrender could sometimes mean mercy. Brutality as a weapon of war. Punishment in Mongol society was not confined to crime. It became a weapon of psychological warfare. Entire populations were executed to set an example for neighboring towns. Survivors were deliberately spared to spread tales of horror. Captured rulers were humiliated or killed in theatrical ways, showing the futility of defying the Khan. The Mongols understood that fear could win battles without swords. Crushing by horses. One of the most infamous punishments was crushing beneath horses. Criminals, traitors, or enemy leaders were placed beneath wooden platforms or carpets. Horses or soldiers then trampled them to death. This method avoided spilling blood directly, which the Mongols sometimes considered unclean, while delivering a slow, agonizing death. Execution by boiling. Certain captured enemies faced death by boiling alive. Cauldrons of water or oil were heated until bubbling. Victims were lowered in, sometimes feet first. The horror of this punishment was not merely physical, it was symbolic of total domination. Siege punishments. Engineering terror. During sieges, the Mongols used cruelty to sap enemy morale. Prisoners might be executed in view of defenders. Others were used as human shields, forced to march before the Mongol armies. Sometimes, captives were catapulted into cities, dead or alive, as psychological weapons. These acts blurred the line between punishment and strategy, embedding fear into the very structure of conquest. Strict military discipline. Inside the Mongol armies, discipline was absolute. Looting without permission could mean death. Falling asleep on guard duty was punishable by execution. Soldiers who disobeyed orders endangered not only themselves but their entire unit. This severity turned ragged horsemen into the most efficient fighting force of the medieval world. Religious tolerance, ruthless law. Curiously, the Mongols were religiously tolerant. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and shamans all found a place under the Khans. But when it came to law and loyalty, there was no tolerance. The empire functioned like a vast army camp, where the law was brutal, direct, and merciless. Punishment for nobility. Even nobles and princes were not safe. If a Khan's relatives defied him, execution awaited. Genghis Khan himself ordered the death of his half-brother Bektar for betrayal. Later rulers followed suit, reminding all that no bloodline stood above loyalty. Humiliation and symbolism. Mongol punishments often carried layers of symbolism. Some enemies were suffocated beneath rugs, denying them the dignity of a warrior's death. Others were executed without shedding blood, preserving ritual purity. Captured leaders were paraded in humiliation before being put to death. Such acts reinforced the idea that the Mongols not only defeated their enemies but stripped them of honor. The spread of fear across continents. The sheer cruelty of Mongol punishments became legend. Cities from China to Persia, from Russia to Eastern Europe, whispered of boiling cauldrons and massacres. The result? Many towns surrendered at the mere sight of a Mongol banner, preferring submission to annihilation. Beyond punishment, order in the empire. Yet within the empire, Mongol law brought a strange kind of order. Trade routes like the Silk Road flourished under Mongol protection. Bandits feared execution, and merchants traveled in safety. It was a paradox. The same empire known for cruelty also created stability and prosperity within its borders. Closing reflection. As you rest, picture the windswept plains of Mongolia, the yurts scattered beneath endless sky, the thundering hooves of armies that once shook the world. Their punishments were cruel, yes, but they were also tools of control, discipline, and domination. The Mongols left behind more than fear. They left a legacy of order forged in fire, reminding history that sometimes the harshest punishments are wielded not only for justice, but for empire itself. Part 8. Punishments in Medieval Europe's High Middle Ages. Introduction: The Theater of Justice. By the 12th to 14th centuries, Europe was changing rapidly. Castles dotted the landscape, cathedrals rose into the sky, and towns bustled with guilds and markets. But beneath the pageantry and faith, justice in the High Middle Ages remained rooted in punishment as spectacle. To live in medieval Europe was to know that the gallows stood at the town's edge, that fire consumed heretics, and that a single accusation might bring trial by ordeal. The punishments were not only retribution, they were public lessons, woven into daily life. The gallows and the rope. The gallows was the quintessential medieval symbol of justice. Executions by hanging were carried out in public squares or on hilltops outside city walls. Bodies were sometimes left hanging for days, serving as grim warnings to travelers. In England, the infamous Tyburn Tree Gallows could hang multiple people at once. The simplicity of the rope made it both efficient and deeply symbolic. The condemned's breath itself was stolen, the rope cutting them off from earthly life. The breaking wheel. One of the most feared punishments was the breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel. Criminals were tied to a large wooden wheel. Executioners smashed their bones with iron bars, breaking limbs one by one. Finally, the broken body was left displayed, nailed to the wheel, for birds to devour. It was brutal, but it was also intended as a performance of divine justice. Each bone broken was a symbolic unmaking of the criminal's life. Burning at the stake. In an age of religious intensity, burning was reserved for heretics, witches, and sometimes political rebels. Victims were tied to wooden stakes and surrounded by faggots of dry wood. Fires consumed them slowly, often beginning at the feet. Crowds gathered, believing they were watching souls purified by flame. For the church, the fire symbolized purgation, a cleansing punishment. For the victim, it was terror beyond words. The ordeal: fire and water decide. Before forensic evidence, medieval Europeans often turned to trial by ordeal, believing God would reveal truth through miraculous survival. Ordeal of fire: the accused carried red-hot iron a set distance. If their wounds healed cleanly, they were declared innocent. Ordeal of water: bound and thrown into water. If they floated, guilt was proven, for pure water rejected the sinful. Such ordeals were terrifying gambles, where belief in divine intervention could decide life or death. Pillory and stocks. Not every punishment meant death. Public humiliation was a powerful weapon. In the stocks, offenders had their feet locked into wooden boards, sometimes for days. The pillory trapped the head and hands, leaving victims exposed to ridicule. Crowds jeered, threw rotten vegetables, or worse. Though not always lethal, humiliation left a deep social scar, branding one as dishonorable. The mutilations, marked forever. Medieval punishments often aimed to mark criminals permanently. Branding, hot irons left symbols on the face or hands. Ear cropping and nose slitting, visible mutilations that marked a person as untrustworthy. Blinding or castration, used for political rivals, ensuring they could never lead or reproduce. These punishments transformed bodies into living testimonies of shame. Drowning and burial alive. For certain crimes, especially infanticide or betrayal, victims faced drowning or even burial alive. Women accused of child murder might be sewn into sacks with stones and cast into rivers. Rebels could be buried beneath city gates, symbolizing their eternal exclusion. Such punishments blurred the line between execution and symbolic ritual, binding justice to earth and water. Punishments of nobility. Even nobles were not immune, though their punishments carried different tones. Beheading by sword or axe was considered honorable, quicker, and cleaner. Traitors, however, might face drawing and quartering, dragged through streets, hanged, disemboweled, and limbs displayed. The elaborate nature of these punishments reflected the gravity of betraying a crown. Witchcraft and the seeds of later persecution. Though the great witch hunts came later, whispers of sorcery already inspired harsh punishment. Suspected witches faced ordeals of water or fire. Their alleged pacts with the devil justified burning or hanging. These early cases planted seeds for centuries of fear that would flare violently in the early modern era. Justice as theater. Every punishment in medieval Europe was a performance. The crowd was part of the ritual. Executions reinforced not only law but the cosmic order. Crime was sin, and sin demanded visible repayment. It was not enough to punish in secret. Justice had to be seen, heard, smelled, and remembered. Closing reflection. As you drift to rest, picture the medieval square. The wooden pillory in shadow, the gallows looming above, the whispers of ordeal by fire and water. For the people of the High Middle Ages, justice was not blind, it was visible, visceral, and unforgettable. In this world, punishment was not simply correction but a public drama, binding community together through fear, spectacle, and shared memory. Part 9, Punishments in Medieval Asia. Introduction, The Weight of Empire. In Europe, punishments were public theater. In Asia, where dynasties and empires stretched vast and deep, punishments often carried an additional layer of imperial authority and cosmic order. Whether in China, Japan, India, or Southeast Asia, punishment was not simply about law, it was about ensuring harmony in a world believed to be bound by moral balance and divine will. China's 5 punishments. In imperial China, justice was codified with terrifying precision. The ancient 5 punishments evolved across dynasties, laying down a grim hierarchy of suffering. Tattooing the face, criminals were permanently marked with ink, branding their shame into flesh. Cutting off the nose, a visible, lifelong stigma that removed dignity. Amputation of feet, both practical and symbolic, those without feet could not flee nor live fully. Castration, gong. A fate worse than death for many men, cutting off family lineage and honor. Death, die by hanging, beheading, or more elaborate means. Later dynasties refined these punishments, but the idea of body as record remained strong. To be mutilated was not only to suffer physically, but also spiritually, as one's body was meant to remain whole in death for the afterlife. Lingqi, the death by 1,000 cuts. Among the most infamous punishments in Chinese history was lingqi, often translated as slow slicing. Introduced formally in the Song dynasty, it was used for severe crimes such as treason, parricide, and sacrilege. The condemned was bound, and executioners sliced the flesh methodically, arms, legs, chest, until the final fatal blow ended life. Records suggest hundreds of cuts, though in practice, the victim often died after a dozen. Lingqi was more than execution, it was a spectacle of dishonor, believed to scatter the soul, leaving no peace even in death. Japan. Samurai justice and tortures. In feudal Japan, justice reflected the rigid hierarchy of samurai, peasants, and outcasts. Punishments varied not only by crime but by class. Seppuku, harakiri for samurai, ritual suicide preserved honor. The condemned cut open his belly, sometimes assisted by a second who delivered the final decapitation. Crucifixion, haritsuke used especially for common criminals or Christians in the 16th to 17th centuries. Victims were tied to wooden crosses and speared. Boiling and burning, severe crimes like arson or rebellion were met with fire or boiling cauldrons. Saw execution, historical records note rebels sometimes being sawed in two between planks. Japanese punishments, like their culture, intertwined discipline with ceremony, ensuring every act carried symbolic weight. India, Dharma and retribution. Ancient and medieval India was governed by Dharmashastra codes and later Islamic Sultanate laws. Punishments reflected both spiritual cosmology and imperial enforcement. Mutilations, cutting off hands for theft, noses for adultery. These punishments left permanent signs of moral failing. Elephant executions, trampling by elephants was used by kings to awe subjects and display royal power. Impalement, particularly recorded in South Indian traditions, criminals were impaled on stakes, left as horrific warnings. Caste-based punishments, crimes were judged not equally but relative to caste, with Brahmins often spared death in favor of fines, while lower castes suffered mutilation or execution. Punishment in India reflected a tension, both sacred law and brutal reality coexisted. The Mongol Empire, swift and merciless. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, Mongol justice was infamous for its severity and speed. Death for theft, even minor theft could bring execution. Breaking of the back, rebels or traitors were bent backward until the spine snapped. Pouring molten silver or lead. Chronicles tell of princes killed by molten metal poured into their eyes, ears, or mouths. Mass executions, whole cities were destroyed if they resisted Mongol rule, demonstrating punishment as collective fate. For the Mongols, law was absolute, and terror was part of governance. Southeast Asia, rituals of kingship and fear. In medieval kingdoms like Angkor, Cambodia, Ayutthaya, Thailand, and pagan Burma, punishment intertwined with sacred kingship. Drowning in crocodile pits, offenders were cast into rivers where crocodiles waited. Crushing, elephants used in India were also recorded in Siam and Burma. Impalement and burning, reserved for traitors, rebels, or those who offended the king's sacred person. Oaths and ordeals, in Cambodia, accused persons were forced to drink water infused with sacred ashes, survival meant innocence. These punishments emphasized the ruler's link to divine justice. To defy the king was not merely treason but a spiritual crime. Punishment as public example. Across Asia, one theme was constant: punishment was meant to be seen. In China, mutilations marked bodies permanently. In Japan, crucifixions were displayed at crossroads. In India, elephants executed criminals before large crowds. In Mongolia, entire cities became examples of disobedience. Just as in Europe, justice was theater, but in Asia, it was often tied explicitly to cosmic order and imperial divinity. Closing reflection. As you drift, imagine the market square of Beijing, the crossroads of Edo, the elephant court of Delhi, or the fields of Samarkand. Punishments were not hidden but displayed, binding law to spectacle, rulers to power, and people to obedience. For those who lived through Asia's medieval centuries, justice was never far away. It might be written in the ink on a criminal's face, carved into their flesh by blade or fire, or whispered through the memory of executions witnessed by whole cities. Part 10: Punishments in the Islamic World. Introduction: The balance of justice and faith. When Islam spread from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, it brought not only a new faith but also a comprehensive legal tradition. Justice was central to Islamic civilization, rooted in the Quran, the Hadith, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and centuries of jurisprudence. Punishment was not merely civic order, it was believed to uphold Sharia, divine law, ensuring balance between crime, repentance, and society. Early Islamic punishments. In the formative centuries, punishments reflected both Bedouin tribal practices and Quranic injunctions. Hudud, fixed penalties. These were punishments set by the Quran and Hadith for specific crimes. Theft, amputation of the hand, though often with strict conditions, value, intention, witnesses. Adultery, stoning for married offenders, lashing for the unmarried. False accusation, 80 lashes for slander without proof. Drinking alcohol, lashes, varying in number across traditions. Qisas, retribution, an eye for an eye. Murder could be avenged by execution, but families could accept compensation, diya, or blood money. Tazir, discretionary punishments. Lesser crimes punished at the judge's discretion, ranging from flogging to fines to exile. Islamic justice always carried the principle of repentance and mercy, a tension between harshness of hudud and compassion encouraged by faith. Abbasid Baghdad, a theater of power. In the glittering capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, punishments sometimes became spectacles of imperial authority. Beheadings and crucifixions, used for rebels and heretics, their bodies displayed on city gates. Flogging and branding, common for theft and fraud. Boiling and burning, rare, but recorded against conspirators or enemies of the caliph. Humiliating parades, corrupt officials might be paraded backward on donkeys through Baghdad's streets. Though the Sharia outlined clear punishments, rulers sometimes wielded justice as a political weapon, especially against rivals or dissenters. The Ottoman Empire, majesty and terror. The Ottomans, who ruled from the 14th to early 20th century, combined Sharia with sultanic law, canon. Punishments reflected their role as defenders of Islam and masters of a vast empire. Impalement, rebels, bandits, or traitors were sometimes impaled and left to die slowly. Strangulation with a bowstring, for nobles or officials, execution by bowstring was considered dignified, avoiding bloodshed. Blinding, to disqualify political rivals from rule, princes or viziers might be blinded. The cage, Kaif's Ottoman princes often confined in gilded cages, spared death but stripped of freedom. Public beheadings, executed at the Hippodrome in Istanbul, often before cheering crowds. Ottoman justice was both majestic and terrifying. Designed to remind subjects that the Sultan was both shadow of God on earth and absolute master. North Africa and the Maghreb. Across Islamic North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt, punishments mirrored both Islamic and local traditions. Amputation and flogging, common for hudud crimes. Crucifixion of rebels, particularly in frontier regions, where tribal loyalty was strong. Public display, severed heads displayed at gates of cities like Cairo or Fez. Slave punishments, enslaved peoples faced harsher justice, including branding or mutilation. Yet in cities like Cairo, legal scholars often tempered harsh penalties, emphasizing rehabilitation over execution. Persia and the Safavids. In Persia, Islamic law mixed with ancient Persian traditions. Bastinado, falaka, beating the soles of the feet, a painful but rarely fatal punishment. Blinding and ear-cutting, political rivals often mutilated rather than killed, to ensure they could not rule. Flaying. Historical records note rebels flayed alive, their skins stuffed and displayed. Stoning and amputation, applied under Sharia, though often avoided through legal technicalities. Persian punishments often symbolized dishonor, ensuring enemies were not only destroyed but remembered with shame. The duality of mercy and severity. Unlike Europe, where punishments often leaned heavily on public brutality, Islamic justice preserved space for repentance and forgiveness. If thieves repented before capture, hudud punishments could be waived. Families of murder victims could pardon killers, gaining divine reward. Judges often sought ways to avoid hudud, preferring fines or exile. Still, the threat of mutilation, lashing, or execution loomed as a constant deterrent. Cultural symbolism of punishments. Punishment in the Islamic world carried symbolic meaning. Amputation symbolized cutting away corruption. Stoning symbolized community rejection. Crucifixion symbolized ultimate disgrace, displayed at gates where travelers could see. Strangulation or blinding emphasized nobility, killing without shedding blood. Every act of justice tied back to a world where law was seen as an extension of divine will. Closing reflection. Imagine the bustling bazaar of Cairo, the golden domes of Baghdad, the courts of Isfahan, or the palaces of Istanbul. Justice there was both swift and dramatic, sometimes merciful, sometimes merciless. A thief might lose a hand, a conspirator might lose his life, and a prince might spend decades behind gilded bars. To live under the Islamic empires was to live in a world where every punishment, from lash to execution, echoed not only the ruler's will but also God's law. For believers, this balance was meant to preserve order and harmony. For rulers, it was a means to display their majesty. Part 11, Punishments in Ancient and Medieval Africa. Introduction, Justice across a vast continent. Africa's vastness holds empires, kingdoms, and cultures as diverse as the deserts of the Sahara and the rainforests of the Congo. From the golden courts of Mali to the fortified walls of Benin, from Ethiopia's Christian kings to the tribal councils of southern Africa, punishments were shaped by custom, religion, and community values. Unlike Europe's obsession with spectacle or the Islamic world's emphasis on divine law, much of Africa's justice was deeply tied to restoration of balance. Yet, when balance failed, or power demanded, it could turn to brutal punishments that echoed across history. Ancient Egypt, the pharaoh's justice. In the land of pyramids and pharaohs, law was sacred. Pharaohs ruled as divine kings, ensuring order through Ma'at, the principle of cosmic balance. Beating and whipping, the most common punishments for theft or corruption, carried out by guards with rods. Amputation, hands, noses, or ears cut off for repeat crimes. Forced labor. Criminals sent to work in quarries, mines, or pyramid projects, often a death sentence. Execution, reserved for treason or grave offenses, often by impalement or burning. Shaming rituals, corrupt officials paraded in disgrace, stripped of titles, their names sometimes erased from monuments, an eternal punishment. Egyptian punishment was not only physical but spiritual. To erase one's name was to erase their soul from the afterlife. Carthage and North Africa. The Phoenician city of Carthage, rival to Rome, adopted Mediterranean customs but with its own severity. Crucifixion, borrowed from the wider Near East, used against generals who failed in war. Sacrificial punishments, some ancient accounts, though debated, claim that criminals, or even children, were burned alive to appease gods like Baal-Hamon. Whipping and enslavement, lesser crimes punished with lashings or permanent servitude. In North Africa, punishments always carried a public message, dishonor, humiliation, and warning. The Mali Empire, Justice of the Munsas. At its height in the 14th century, the Mali Empire stretched across West Africa, famed for gold, learning, and the pilgrimage of Mansa Musa. Its justice combined Islamic law with local traditions. Amputation, for theft, echoing Sharia. Exile or banishment, to remove offenders from their communities. Execution for treason, rebels or enemies of the emperor faced hanging or beheading. Community flogging, criminals whipped in the marketplace before their peers. The Mali legal code often emphasized restitution. Thieves might return goods many times over, restoring harmony rather than creating endless cycles of vengeance. The Benin Kingdom, ritual power and fear. The Kingdom of Benin, in present-day Nigeria, wielded justice as both sacred ritual and royal authority. Beheadings, public executions reinforced the Oba's absolute power. Drowning, some offenders were cast into rivers, symbolizing cleansing of impurity. Ritual sacrifice. Captives or criminals could be killed in ceremonies to honor deities or ancestors. Mutilation, ears, lips, or hands cut off, leaving permanent reminders of disobedience. Punishments here blurred the line between justice and religion, ensuring not just social order but cosmic favor. Ethiopia, the Christian highlands. In Ethiopia, one of the world's oldest Christian kingdoms, justice fused biblical law with royal tradition. Amputation of hands or feet, for theft, echoing biblical injunctions. Blinding of rivals, like Byzantium, blinding was a political punishment, ensuring rivals could never rule. Death by stoning, applied for adultery or heresy, drawn from Scripture. Whipping, administered in monasteries as both punishment and penance. Ethiopian chronicles describe emperors as guardians of both faith and law, where punishment was seen as purifying sin as much as controlling crime. Central Africa, tribal justice. In many Central African societies, punishment reflected communal survival more than state law. Trial by ordeal, accused forced to drink poison or handle hot irons. Surviving meant innocence. Exile, removing dangerous individuals from the tribe. Beatings and scars, whipping or marking criminals, ensuring their deeds were never forgotten. Execution for witchcraft, accused witches often burned, drowned, or stoned, believed to end their power. These punishments were deeply tied to belief in spirits, where crime was not only against people but against the supernatural order. Southern Africa, Shaka Zulu and beyond. In Southern Africa, tribal justice could be both practical and terrifying. Under the Zulu king Shaka, early 19th century. Execution by spear, soldiers who showed cowardice speared in front of their regiment. Family punishments, sometimes entire households executed to prevent vengeance. Exile or shaming, lesser offenders stripped of cattle, leaving them destitute. Zulu justice emphasized loyalty, courage, and communal strength. To fail was not only a crime but a betrayal of the tribe. The role of humiliation. Across Africa, humiliation was as powerful as pain. Criminals might be paraded naked through villages. Lose hair, jewelry, or clothing, symbols of honor. Have scars or brands carved into their bodies. Such punishments ensured that shame lasted long after wounds healed. A world of duality. African punishments ranged from merciless execution to community-based reconciliation. In many places, the priority was not cruelty but restoration. Yet when rulers needed to assert dominance, pharaohs, obis, emperors, the punishments became unforgettable spectacles. Closing reflection. Picture the Nile's banks where thieves were whipped, the desert gates of Carthage where traitors hung on crosses, the golden palaces of Mali where justice mixed with mercy, and the sacred shrines of Benin where rituals claimed human lives. Across Africa, punishment was never only about crime, it was about balance, power, spirit, and memory. To live in these times was to live knowing that justice might mean a beating, an exile, or a death meant not just to end a life, but to restore harmony between people, gods, and the world itself. Part 12, Punishments in Ancient India and Southeast Asia. Introduction, Law, Dharma, and Discipline. In the vast lands of India and Southeast Asia, justice was never simply about crime and punishment. It was about dharma, the cosmic order, duty, and moral law. Kings were seen as guardians of justice, charged with protecting balance. From the ancient codes of India to the palace courts of Siam and Angkor, punishments blended religion, ritual, and raw power. The brutality here was both physical and symbolic, designed not only to correct criminals but to preserve harmony between humans, gods, and society. Ancient India, the laws of Manu and beyond. One of the oldest law codes in the world is the Manusmriti, Laws of Manu, written between 200 BCE and 200 CE. It prescribed punishments depending on caste, gender, and offense. Whipping and beating, for common thefts or disobedience. Amputation, hands cut off for stealing, feet for fleeing soldiers. Fines and restitution. Brahmins often escaped physical punishment, paying fines instead. Exile, wrongdoers banished from their community, condemned to wander. Death penalties, for treason, adultery, and poisoning. Methods included burning alive, drowning, or impalement. The cruelty varied by caste, Lower castes faced harsher penalties, while Brahmins often escaped with symbolic punishments. Justice reinforced social hierarchy as much as law. Mauryan and Gupta empires, power of the kings. The Mauryan Empire, 321 to 185 BCE, especially under Chandragupta and Ashoka, wielded severe punishments to hold vast territories together. Torture before execution, whipping, burning with hot irons, or stretching on racks. Mutilation, noses or ears cut off for thieves or adulterers. Elephant executions, criminals crushed beneath royal elephants, sometimes trained to prolong agony. Impalement, a gruesome death reserved for rebels and traitors. Yet Ashoka, after converting to Buddhism, famously renounced much cruelty, though punishments still remained for serious crimes. Hindu punishments, symbolism and ritual. Hindu justice often blended spiritual symbolism into punishment. Marking with red-hot iron, to permanently identify wrongdoers. Cutting of hair or beard, a humiliation, stripping away dignity. Fasting or atonement rituals, a way to cleanse guilt without physical harm. Public shaming, criminals paraded on donkeys, mocked by the crowd. The emphasis was on restoring cosmic balance, but the cruelty of mutilation showed that society demanded visible scars of guilt. Buddhist influence, mercy and ordeals. With the spread of Buddhism, especially in India, Sri Lanka, Burma, and Thailand, punishments shifted toward moral correction. But practice did not always align with ideals. Whipping or caning, used in monasteries for monks breaking vows. Exile from monastic orders, spiritual banishment, seen as worse than physical harm. Ordeals of fire or water. Accused forced to walk across hot coals or plunge hands into boiling water, survival meant innocence. Execution for treason, despite Buddhist compassion, rulers still executed rebels or criminals threatening the state. The paradox of Buddhist justice lay in the tension between mercy and necessity. Southeast Asia, Khmer Empire and Angkor. In Cambodia's Khmer Empire, 9th to 15th century, justice reflected Hindu and Buddhist traditions, but also royal absolutism. Impalement and crucifixion, for traitors and enemies. Drowning in rivers, a ritual cleansing through water. Forced labor, prisoners worked on temples like Angkor Wat, endless toil under the tropical sun. Mutilation for theft, thieves might lose hands, noses, or even eyes. Temples carved in stone depicted not just gods but punishments, visual reminders that law was sacred. Siam, Thailand royal courts of pain. In medieval Siam, punishments were often spectacular and symbolic. Crushing by elephants. Like in India, elephants trampled criminals. Boiling in oil, a horrific death reserved for traitors. Whipping and shackling, daily tortures in prison. Execution by sword, swift, ceremonial, often overseen by royal decree. Justice here was about spectacle, reinforcing the divine aura of the king. Java and the Majapahit Empire. In Indonesia, Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms like Majapahit, 13th to 16th century, had their own brutal methods. Drowning at sea, criminals bound and cast into the waves. Amputation of fingers or toes, a permanent mark of shame. Ritual sacrifice, in rare cases, criminals killed in temple ceremonies. Exile to islands, banishment to remote lands, often a slow death. Maritime justice often mirrored the dangers of the sea, punishment became a journey into oblivion. Torture and trials by ordeal. Across India and Southeast Asia, ordeals tested guilt in supernatural ways. Hot iron test, holding red-hot metal, burns meant guilt. Water ordeal, being thrown into a river. Sinking meant innocence, floating meant guilt. Poison ordeal, drinking poison, survival proving purity. Sacred oaths, breaking a vow before gods brought divine punishment. These trials reveal a world where humans trusted fate and the gods more than evidence. Social humiliation, punishment beyond pain. Beyond execution or mutilation, punishment often involved shame. Women paraded half-dressed for adultery. Thieves branded so they could never hide. Criminals forced to live outside caste and society, social death. In these cultures, exclusion was often worse than physical wounds. Closing reflection. From the ancient laws of Manu to the temples of Angkor, punishment in India and Southeast Asia was never random. It was woven into religion, kingship, and cosmic order. Elephants crushing rebels, boiling oil in Siam, ordeals of fire and water, each was a stage upon which law, power, and faith performed their eternal drama. For those who lived under these laws, justice was not only a system. It was destiny, determined as much by gods and spirits as by kings and judges. Part 13, Punishments in China and the Far East. Introduction, Harmony, Order, and Authority. In China and the Far East, law was more than rules, it was an expression of Confucian morality, imperial authority, and cosmic harmony. Punishment was not simply to deter crime, but to restore order when the balance of society had been disrupted. For thousands of years, dynasties created elaborate systems of justice, where cruelty, ritual, and symbolism intertwined. From the infamous death by 1,000 cuts to humiliating public punishments, this region's history reveals how discipline was as much about obedience as it was about survival. Ancient China, the 5 punishments. In the earliest Chinese law codes, stretching back to the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE, criminals faced the 5 punishments, wusheng. These were designed to permanently mark the body, ensuring shame endured for life. Tattooing, mo. Criminals tattooed on the face, branding them for all to see. Cutting off the nose, a mutilation leaving permanent disfigurement. Amputation of the feet, the guilty reduced to crawling, a life of humiliation. Castration, gong, a devastating punishment, robbing men of family lineage. Execution, pai death as the final punishment for the gravest crimes. These punishments were deliberately visible, designed to make the criminal a living warning to others. The Han Dynasty, strict laws and public display. During the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, punishments grew even harsher. Execution by beheading, public, ceremonial, and often displayed. Impalement, reserved for traitors and rebels. Flogging and beatings, hundreds of lashes could be administered, often fatal. Exile to remote regions, criminals sent to harsh frontiers to serve the empire. The Han also codified collective punishment. Entire families executed for treason, reflecting the Confucian idea of shared responsibility. Tang and Song dynasties, refinement and cruelty. The Tang Code, 7th century, became one of the most influential law codes in Asia. It balanced Confucian morality with harsh enforcement. Kong, wooden kangs, large boards locked around a prisoner's neck, forcing them to carry the burden in public. Flogging with bamboo canes, up to 100 strokes, often fatal. Exile with hard labor, criminals forced to mine salt or build frontier walls. Decapitation versus strangulation, different methods of execution, with strangulation seen as more merciful. The Song dynasty, 960 to 1279, expanded punishments for corruption and treason, recognizing how social order depended on loyal officials. Ming dynasty, the height of imperial punishments. The Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, perfected brutal punishment as political theater. Lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts, perhaps the most infamous punishment in Chinese history. A slow dismemberment where slices were taken from the body over hours, meant for traitors and parricides. It symbolized not only physical pain but the destruction of the soul. Execution by slicing, less elaborate than lynching, but still gruesome. Castration of families, when officials betrayed the emperor, their male heirs could be castrated to end bloodlines. Beating with the heavy rod, a thicker bamboo, capable of breaking bones. Public display of corpses, heads of traitors displayed on city walls. Ming justice was not subtle, it was designed to terrify. Qing Dynasty, Imperial Law and Severity. The Qing Dynasty, 1644 to 1912, inherited Ming cruelty but institutionalized it with bureaucratic precision. Lingqi continued, executed in public squares, with records carefully kept. Kowtowing before execution, prisoners forced to bow to the emperor's portrait before death. Exile to Xinjiang or Mongolia, harsh, often a slow death. Kangs as public humiliation. Prisoners starved in the streets, dependent on pity for food. Beheading with drums, military executions accompanied by drums, reinforcing imperial power. By the 19th century, Western observers described Qing punishments as both barbaric and ceremonial. Japan, samurai justice and Tokugawa law. In Japan, punishments reflected samurai honor and strict feudal codes. Seppuku, harakiri ritual suicide by disembowelment, reserved for samurai to preserve honor. Crucifixion, haritsuke criminals tied to crosses and speared. Boiling and burning alive, used in early shogunate rule. Beheading, swift, honorable, but still public. Exile to remote islands, similar to Chinese banishment. The Tokugawa shogunate, 1603 to 1868, emphasized public deterrence, criminals paraded through towns, punished before crowds, reinforcing obedience. Korea, Confucian influence and Joseon law. In Korea's Joseon dynasty, 1392 to 1897, punishments mirrored Chinese systems but emphasized hierarchy. Beating with sticks, jang. The most common punishment, administered in hundreds of blows. Exile to villages, criminals forced into rural isolation. Execution by beheading or hanging, reserved for the most serious crimes. Mutilation, ears or noses cut off for theft. Confucian ideals meant punishment reinforced family responsibility, fathers punished for sons, masters for servants. Vietnam and Southeast Asian influence. Vietnam, influenced by Chinese law, also adopted severe punishments. Beheading and impalement, for rebellion or treason. Amputation of limbs, for theft. Kang punishment, shared with China, humiliating criminals in public. Collective punishments, families executed for treason. Vietnamese dynasties saw law as an extension of imperial power, much like their Chinese neighbors. Symbolism of punishment in the Far East. What unites these cultures is the symbolism of punishment. Cutting the body, a fate worse than death, believed to destroy the soul. Public display. Law was theater, performed before the masses. Exile, a living death, separation from family and home. Hierarchy in punishment, nobles and commoners never received the same justice. The cruelty was deliberate, it was meant to restore cosmic balance, reinforce authority, and instill fear. Closing reflection. From tattooing the faces of criminals in ancient China to the ritual seppuku of Japanese samurai, the Far East blended spiritual symbolism and political theater into punishment. The infamous lingqi became a symbol of ultimate cruelty, not simply because of the pain, but because it represented the erasure of honor, body, and spirit. Across the region, justice was never blind, it was a tool wielded by emperors and shoguns to preserve harmony, obedience, and power. Part 14, Punishments in the Islamic World and the Middle East. Introduction, Justice, Faith, and Authority. In the Islamic world and the wider Middle East, punishment was not merely the act of punishing wrongdoing. It was seen as the manifestation of divine justice. Rooted in Sharia law and centuries of custom, punishments were designed to protect society, uphold morality, and deter transgressions through public visibility and severity. Across the caliphates, the Ottoman Empire, and medieval Islamic states, punishments reflected a fusion of religious doctrine, political necessity, and cultural tradition. What emerged was a legal system where the body, honor, and spirit could all be targeted as tools of discipline. Foundations of Islamic punishment. Islamic law, or Sharia, outlines specific crimes known as hudud, plural of had, meaning limit or boundary. These crimes, considered offenses against God, carried mandatory punishments if proven beyond doubt. The main hudud crimes included theft, sarika punished by amputation of the hand; adultery, zina punished by stoning, for married offenders, or flogging, for unmarried; drinking alcohol, shurb al-kamr punished by flogging; apostasy, ridda often punished by death; highway robbery, hiraba punishments ranged from execution, crucifixion, or amputation, depending on severity. Beyond hudud, judges, qadis, could apply tazir punishments, which were discretionary and often included imprisonment, flogging, or fines. Stoning to death, ram. Perhaps the most infamous of Sharia punishments, stoning to death was reserved for adultery by married offenders. The condemned was buried up to the chest or waist. Stones were thrown by the community, large enough to inflict pain but small enough to prolong suffering. Symbolically, the act reinforced communal morality. The whole community participated in cleansing itself of sin. Though rarely carried out in some eras, the very existence of ram became a powerful deterrent. Amputation for theft. The punishment for theft was amputation of the right hand. This punishment was rooted in the Quran, Surah Al-Ma'idah 5:38. It symbolized both retribution and warning. The criminal's missing hand marked them forever. Exceptions existed. Theft from hunger or extreme necessity was not punished. While severe, Islamic law sought to set very high evidentiary standards, 2 reliable witnesses, proof of intent, and value thresholds. Flogging, a common punishment. Flogging was widespread, applied for offenses ranging from alcohol consumption to slander. Sentences often ranged from 40 to 100 lashes. The whip or cane was applied in public squares. The strikes were carefully regulated, not intended to kill, but to humiliate and correct. Public flogging became a spectacle, reinforcing moral codes and warning others. Crucifixion, salb, and highway robbery. For highway robbery or rebellion, the Quran prescribed a range of punishments: execution, crucifixion, or mutilation. Crucifixion, salb, criminals executed, then displayed on crosses as a warning. Combined punishments, some were first executed, then crucified. Mutilation. Hands and feet cut off on opposite sides. These punishments were aimed at protecting public order and security, especially in times when trade routes were vital to the empire. The Abbasid Caliphate, political punishments. During the Abbasid era, 750 to 1258 CE, punishments became instruments of political control. Public executions, rebels and heretics often beheaded in Baghdad squares. Drowning and burning, punishments for traitors. Impalement, particularly humiliating, used for political rebels. Prison tortures, extended incarcerations with starvation, darkness, and chains. The Abbasid caliphs used punishment not only for crime but to demonstrate their absolute authority. The Ottoman Empire, blending Sharia and custom. The Ottoman Empire, 1299 to 1922, inherited Sharia but layered it with its own penal practices. Strangulation with a bowstring, a noble execution for high-ranking officials. Blood was avoided out of respect. Impaling. Used for traitors and rebels, bodies left on display. Decapitation, common, often with dramatic public ceremonies. Exile and forced labor, lesser sentences included being sent to galleys as oarsmen. The Ottomans also used the punishment of the bastinado, striking the soles of the feet with sticks, causing excruciating pain without necessarily killing. Persian and Middle Eastern punishments. In Persia and other Middle Eastern kingdoms, punishments combined Islamic law with older traditions. Blinding, often used to disqualify rivals from rule. Skinning alive, rare, but practiced as ultimate terror. Pouring molten metal, a legendary punishment for treason. Execution by elephants, South Asia and Persia, elephants trained to crush or dismember criminals. These reflected both Islamic influence and pre-Islamic customs that persisted through dynastic rule. Gendered punishments. Punishments in the Islamic world also reflected gender dynamics. Women accused of adultery, subjected to stoning or public shaming. Men for false accusations, flogging if accusations could not be proven. Castration, occasionally used against eunuchs who broke palace rules. The body became a social battlefield, where morality and obedience were inscribed through pain. Symbolism and theology of punishment. Punishment in Islamic law carried symbolic meaning. Amputation, the removal of the tool of sin. Stoning, the community collectively rejecting immorality. Flogging, purification through pain. Exile or death, separation of corruption from the community. In every case, the purpose was not only to punish but to restore balance, purify society, and deter future crimes. Closing reflection. In the Islamic world and Middle East, punishment was deeply entwined with faith and authority. It was both spiritual and political, an attempt to preserve order through visible, symbolic acts of discipline. From stoning and amputations prescribed by Sharia, to the political executions of the Abbasids and Ottomans, punishments reflected a world where law and divine will were inseparable. The body, broken and shamed, became the ultimate canvas upon which the lessons of obedience were written. Part 15, Punishments in Medieval and Renaissance Europe. Introduction, a world obsessed with order. Medieval and Renaissance Europe was a society where religion, monarchy, and law were woven together in a single fabric of authority. Punishment was not simply about retribution, it was a public performance of morality, power, and fear. From the Gothic cathedrals to the cobblestone town squares, justice was put on display so that every villager, merchant, and noble would know the consequences of defying God, king, or law. Europe during these centuries witnessed an almost theatrical intensity of punishment, executions staged as pageants, torture chambers hidden in castle dungeons, and inquisitorial courts that probed the mind as much as the body. The public execution, theater of justice. In Europe, executions were not private matters. They were grand public rituals. Town squares, gallows erected in central markets or crossroads. Audiences. Entire towns summoned to watch, from children to elders. Ceremony, priests preached sermons, heralds read decrees, and drummers beat solemn rhythms. Executions became moral lessons in real time, intended to terrify the crowd into obedience. Hanging, the common death. Hanging was the most widespread form of execution in medieval Europe, particularly for theft, robbery, or murder. The condemned climbed a ladder or cart, noose around their neck. The cart was pulled away, or the ladder kicked aside. Death came slowly by strangulation, often taking minutes. Some were left dangling for days as a warning to others. The sight of corpses swinging in the wind was both grim and familiar in medieval life. Burning at the stake. Burning at the stake was associated with heresy, witchcraft, and treason. The condemned was chained to a post surrounded by wood. Fires were lit gradually, prolonging agony. Sometimes damp straw was used to create thick smoke, suffocating before flames consumed the body. Burning was symbolic, fire was seen as purification, consuming the sinful flesh. Beheading, the noble death. Reserved for nobles and aristocrats, beheading was considered more honorable than hanging or burning. Carried out with an axe or sword. A skilled executioner could sever the head in a single blow. In bungled cases, multiple strikes turned dignity into horror. Perhaps the most famous was Anne Boleyn, executed by sword in 1536. Her calm composure contrasted sharply with the spectacle of death. The guillotine's predecessors. Before the French guillotine of 1792, medieval Europe already had mechanical beheading devices. The Halifax gibbet, England, and the Maiden, Scotland heavy blades dropped from frames. These machines foreshadowed the efficiency of later revolutionary justice. The rack, stretching the body. In castle dungeons, the rack was a dreaded instrument. A wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim's wrists and ankles tied, then pulled in opposite directions. Muscles tore, joints dislocated, bones cracked. The rack was often used to extract confessions rather than kill outright. The Iron Maiden, myth or reality? The infamous Iron Maiden, a coffin-shaped device lined with spikes, is often cited as a medieval torture tool. Victims supposedly locked inside, pierced by iron spikes. Some historians argue it was more a Renaissance invention, or even later myth. Regardless of authenticity, it became a powerful symbol of Europe's dark imagination. The wheel, breaking the body. Known as the breaking wheel, this execution was gruesome. The condemned was tied to a wagon wheel. Limbs were shattered with an iron hammer or club. The body sometimes woven into the spokes and displayed. In Germany and France, the wheel was infamous for its slow, brutal spectacle. The Inquisition and religious punishments. The Inquisition embodied Europe's merging of faith and punishment. Heresy trials, suspects interrogated with torture. Confessions extracted. The rack, strappado, and thumbscrews were common. Auto da fe, public ceremonies where heretics were sentenced and often burned. The Inquisition showed how Europe treated belief itself as a crime. Punishments for witchcraft. The witch hunts of the late medieval and Renaissance period brought unique punishments. Swimming test, accused witches thrown into water. If they floated, they were guilty. Burning at the stake, seen as purging evil. Strangulation before burning, sometimes mercy was given by choking before fire consumed the body. Tens of thousands of women, and some men, were executed as witches between the 15th and 17th centuries. Mutilations and branding. For lesser crimes, punishments did not kill but scarred. Branding with hot irons, letters burned into the skin, T for thief, H for heretic. Ear cropping or nose slitting, visible lifelong stigma. Tongue removal, for blasphemers or false accusers. The body became a living record of guilt. Prison and the dungeon. Medieval prisons were not long-term sentences but holding spaces. Cold, dark, disease-ridden cells. Prisoners chained, fed bread and water. Torture chambers hidden within castles. It was not until the Renaissance that the idea of prison as punishment began to take hold. Spectacle and morality. Medieval punishments were not merely cruel, they were ritualized morality plays. Every execution sermonized on sin and virtue. The crowd participated, jeering, praying, or throwing stones. Punishment was as much about teaching obedience as it was about punishing crime. Closing reflection. Punishment in medieval and Renaissance Europe was severe, theatrical, and symbolic. From the stake to the gallows, the wheel to the dungeon, each punishment was an echo of the society's obsession with order, faith, and authority. It was a world where justice was written in fire and blood, where the condemned's body was transformed into a warning for generations. Part 16. Punishments in the colonial era and early modern world. Introduction, New Lands, Old Punishments. As European powers expanded across the world between the 16th and 18th centuries, they carried with them their systems of law and punishment. The gallows, the whipping post, and the branding iron crossed oceans to the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Yet in these new contexts, punishment acquired new meanings, serving not only to discipline criminals but also to control colonized peoples, enslaved laborers, and rebellious subjects. The colonial era was thus marked by punishments that were not only brutal but also deeply entangled with empire, slavery, and cultural domination. Whipping and the whipping post. Few punishments were as common in the colonial world as the whip. Public whippings, criminals, enslaved persons, and indentured servants were tied to posts or carts. Instruments, whips made of rawhide, cat-o'-nine-tails, or knotted rope. Spectacle. Crowds assembled to watch, as lashes tore open skin. Whipping was designed to instill fear and obedience, particularly among enslaved people who resisted. Branding in the colonies. Branding, already used in Europe, took on new functions in colonial societies. Slaves and criminals, branded with initials or symbols of ownership. Runaways, captured enslaved people branded with R for runaway. Criminal codes, some colonies branded thieves with letters like T. Branding permanently marked the body, turning human beings into visible property or criminals. Execution by hanging in the New World. Hanging remained the most common capital punishment. Colonial America, gallows were built in central squares, echoing Europe's tradition. Pirates, hung at harbors, their bodies left in chains as warnings. Native resistance leaders, executed to discourage uprisings. One famous case was the hanging of pirates at Port Royal, Jamaica, after the city's crackdown on piracy in the 17th century. The Salem witch trials. Perhaps the most infamous colonial punishment spectacle occurred in Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. Accusations of witchcraft, dozens arrested, interrogated, and jailed. Executions, 19 executed by hanging, and one man, Giles Corey, pressed to death with stones for refusing to confess. Psychology of fear, a society overwhelmed by superstition, fear, and control. The Salem witch trials remain a symbol of the dangers of mass hysteria and brutal legal systems. The pressing of Giles Corey. The punishment of pressing, placing stones upon a victim until crushed, was rare, but Corey's case showed its persistence. Corey refused to plead guilty or not guilty, trying to protect his family's inheritance. He was slowly crushed under increasing weight. His last words, "more weight," entered American legend. This gruesome death symbolized the extremities colonial justice could reach. Slave codes and plantation punishments. In the Caribbean and American South, enslaved people lived under slave codes that prescribed brutal punishments. Whippings and beatings, for disobedience, resistance, or escape attempts. Mutilation, ears cut off, Achilles tendons slashed to prevent running. Execution, enslaved people accused of rebellion were burned, hanged, or broken on the wheel. These punishments reinforced slavery's system of terror. Colonial Africa and corporal punishment. In Africa, where European trading posts and colonies expanded, punishments often targeted local resistance. Floggings by traders, African porters or slaves whipped for disobedience. Executions for rebellion, leaders resisting colonial expansion executed publicly. Forced labor penalties, workers punished with starvation, chains, or whips. Punishment became a tool of economic exploitation as much as criminal justice. Pillories and stocks in the New World. Borrowed from Europe, pillories and stocks appeared in colonial towns. Stocks. Immobilized legs and feet, leaving victims open to ridicule. Pillory, clamped the head and hands, often combined with whipping. Public humiliation, eggs, rotten food, and stones thrown by crowds. In Puritan New England, these devices became moral lessons, forcing sinners to endure shame. Piracy and maritime punishments. The seas of the colonial era were rife with pirates, smugglers, and naval mutineers. Punishments at sea were unique and terrifying. Keel hauling, a sailor dragged under the ship's barnacle-covered hull. Marooning, pirates abandoned rebels on desert islands with minimal supplies. Hanging at the yardarm, mutineers executed before the entire crew. Naval discipline was harsh, enforcing order across vast oceans. Spanish Inquisition in the colonies. The Spanish Inquisition extended into the Americas. Accused heretics, indigenous converts accused of backsliding, Jews, and Protestants punished. Torture, carried out to extract confessions. Executions. Auto de fe ceremonies replicated in Mexico, Peru, and elsewhere. The Inquisition reinforced Catholic orthodoxy across Spain's vast empire. Punishments for indigenous resistance. Colonial authorities punished indigenous resistance with severity. Mass executions, leaders executed publicly after uprisings. Forced labor and relocation, whole villages enslaved or relocated. Symbolic punishments, leaders executed in culturally humiliating ways. Punishment was not only physical but also psychological, designed to break indigenous authority. The emergence of penal colonies. Colonial powers used punishment as colonization itself. Britain sent convicts to North America, then Australia. Harsh labor, convicts forced to build infrastructure. Isolation, exile became punishment, reshaping global migration. Australia's early history as a penal colony epitomized the link between punishment and empire. Torture as interrogation. Though Enlightenment thinkers began questioning torture, in many colonies it persisted. Thumbscrews, whips, and stocks, used to extract confessions. Slave interrogations, enslaved people tortured to reveal networks of resistance. Political rebels, subjected to brutal methods before execution. Torture maintained control through terror. Closing reflection. The colonial era extended Europe's traditions of punishment across continents. Yet within colonies, punishment became more than law enforcement, it became a tool of domination. It was used to enforce slavery, suppress rebellion, and humiliate entire populations. From gallows in Boston to whipping posts in Jamaica, from marooning pirates at sea to branding runaways in Virginia, colonial punishments were woven into the machinery of empire itself. In this period, punishment was not only about individuals, it was about shaping entire societies under colonial control. Part 17, Punishments in the Age of Revolutions and the 18th to 19th Centuries. Introduction, A World in Upheaval. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were marked by extraordinary political and social upheavals. Revolutions swept across America, France, Haiti, and Latin America. Monarchies trembled, empires fractured, and new republics were born. Amid these transformations, punishment itself was reshaped, sometimes becoming more brutal in the chaos of revolution, sometimes moving toward reform in the name of liberty and reason. This was the era of the guillotine, the rise of modern prisons, and the beginning of debates over what punishment should mean in an age of freedom. The French Revolution and the guillotine. Few images symbolize revolutionary punishment more than the guillotine. Invention, designed by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin as a humane method of execution, meant to be swift and equal for all classes. Symbol of equality, nobles and peasants alike faced the same blade. The Reign of Terror, 1793 to 1794, thousands executed, including King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. Crowds gathered in Paris to watch, turning executions into a grim form of public theater. Revolutionary justice, swift and severe. Revolutionary tribunals often favored speed over fairness. Accusations of treason, common, often without real evidence. Mass executions, carried out to instill fear and protect revolutionary ideals. Psychological impact, the guillotine became both a tool of justice and a symbol of paranoia. Punishment in revolutionary France was less about the individual crime and more about political loyalty. The American Revolution and punishments of rebels. In colonial America, revolutionaries and loyalists alike faced harsh punishments. Tar and feathering, rebels punished loyalists by covering them in tar and feathers, parading them through towns. Hanging spies, both British and Americans executed suspected spies. Prison ships. Captured soldiers and civilians often confined in appalling conditions, where disease and starvation killed many. The revolution revealed that punishment could serve as both vengeance and political theater. Haitian Revolution, punishments and reprisals. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, was the only successful slave revolt in history. Punishments during the conflict were severe. Slave punishments, before the revolt, whippings, mutilation, and execution enforced the plantation system. Revolutionary reprisals, enslaved rebels turned punishments against their former masters, executing them in public. Fear in the Atlantic world, the revolt terrified colonial powers, who responded with further brutality in their own colonies. Punishment in Haiti became both a tool of terror and a cry for liberation. Penal reform in the Enlightenment spirit. While revolutions created spectacles of violence, Enlightenment thinkers questioned traditional punishments. Cesare Beccaриa's On Crimes and Punishments, 1764 argued against torture and cruel executions. Jeremy Bentham proposed utilitarian reform and designed the Panopticon, a prison allowing total surveillance. Shift toward prisons. The 18th century saw prisons begin to replace corporal and capital punishment. This intellectual movement marked the beginning of modern penal philosophy. The rise of the prison. The 18th and 19th centuries transformed prisons from holding cells into sites of punishment themselves. Workhouses, prisoners forced into hard labor. Silent system, prisoners prohibited from speaking, instilling discipline. Solitary confinement, introduced as a way to encourage reflection, though often leading to madness. The prison became both a punishment and a social experiment. Transportation and penal colonies. Britain pioneered a new form of punishment, exile to penal colonies. Australia, beginning in 1788, thousands of convicts shipped to Botany Bay. Harsh labor. Building roads, farms, and settlements under guard. Isolation, convicts cut off from homeland, families, and community. Transportation reflected both punishment and empire building, reshaping entire continents. Industrial Revolution and harsh justice. The Industrial Revolution brought new crimes and new punishments. Child labor offenses, children themselves often punished harshly for theft. Public hangings in Britain continued into the 19th century, often drawing thousands. Prison expansion, growing cities led to more crime and more prisons. Punishment reflected anxieties about urban disorder and working-class unrest. Debtors' prisons. Debt was treated as a crime, with imprisonment common for those unable to pay. Conditions, overcrowded, filthy prisons where debtors lived until families could pay. Famous example, Charles Dickens' father was imprisoned in Marshalsea, inspiring Dickens' later works. Criticism and reform. By the 19th century, reformers began to push for more humane treatment. Debtors' prisons highlighted how punishment often targeted the poor. Public executions and their decline. The 18th and early 19th centuries witnessed the slow decline of public executions. Britain, crowds of thousands gathered at Tyburn gallows. Moral criticism, reformers argued that crowds were entertained, not deterred. Transition, executions moved behind prison walls in the mid-19th century. This shift reflected a changing view of punishment as a private, rather than public, act. Military punishments. Revolutions and wars brought unique military punishments. Flogging in the army, common for desertion, drunkenness, or disobedience. Execution for desertion, carried out swiftly to maintain discipline. Drumming out, soldiers publicly humiliated, stripped of insignia, and expelled. The military continued to use harsh measures to enforce obedience in a time of mass conscription. Colonial punishments in the 19th century. As European empires expanded, colonial punishments reinforced domination. Forced labor. In Africa and Asia, punishment often meant grueling work projects. Execution of rebels, resistance leaders often made examples in public trials. Cultural humiliation, punishments targeted not only bodies but traditions and authority structures. Punishment served as a visible reminder of empire's power. Social control through punishment. Punishment in this era was about more than crime, it was about controlling populations. Workers, strikes and riots suppressed through imprisonment or execution. Women, punished for crimes of morality, such as adultery or prostitution. The poor, targeted through vagrancy laws, debtors' prisons, and harsh labor sentences. The state used punishment to reinforce social hierarchies during industrial and political change. Closing reflection. The age of revolutions transformed punishment in contradictory ways. On one hand, the guillotine and revolutionary terror revealed punishment's most brutal possibilities. On the other hand, Enlightenment reformers laid the groundwork for modern penal systems, with prisons, rehabilitation, and human rights debates. This was an age where punishment could mean being crushed beneath the blade of a guillotine in Paris, tarred and feathered in colonial America, or transported across the world to Australia. It was a time when punishment still brutalized, but also began to evolve towards something more systematic, more hidden, and arguably more enduring. Part 18: Punishments in the Victorian Era and the Age of Empire. Introduction: Morality, Reform, and Empire. The Victorian Era, 1837 to 1901, was a period of contradiction. It prided itself on moral refinement and progress, yet its punishments could be both harsh and hypocritical. At home, prisons expanded, workhouses multiplied, and social discipline was enforced with new rigor. Abroad, the British Empire wielded punishment as a weapon of dominance, subjecting colonized peoples to brutal reprisals. This was an age of moral punishment, where shame, discipline, and social order were prized as much as the lash or the noose. The Victorian prison system. The 19th century saw the consolidation of the prison as the central form of punishment. The separate system, prisoners kept in solitary confinement, expected to reflect on sins. Silence and isolation often caused mental breakdowns. The silent system, prisoners labored together but were forbidden to speak, communicating only with gestures. Hard labor, treadmills, crank machines, and stone-breaking became standard punishments, intended to instill discipline through monotonous toil. Prisons became a tool not only of justice but also of moral reform, designed to reshape character. Workhouses and the Poor Laws. For the poor, the greatest punishment was the workhouse. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act established workhouses for the destitute. Conditions: harsh, with families separated, monotonous labor, and meager food. Deterrence: designed to make relief so unpleasant that only the desperate would seek it. Workhouses punished poverty itself, reflecting Victorian anxieties about laziness and dependency. Public executions and their end. By mid-century, public executions were falling out of favor. Last public execution in Britain, 1868. Crowds gathered for the hanging of Michael Barrett in London. Shift to privacy. Executions moved behind prison walls, reflecting a desire to sanitize justice. Moral concerns. Reformers argued that executions were spectacles of vice, not deterrents. This change marked a significant shift. Punishment became hidden, more institutional, less theatrical. Corporal punishment in schools and homes. Discipline extended beyond the prison. Schools, caning, birching, and strapping were routine. Domestic sphere. Parents often used physical punishment to instill obedience. Moral framing. Violence was justified as necessary for building character. Punishment in daily life reinforced strict social hierarchies and respectability. Women and punishment. Victorian society imposed distinct punishments for women. Moral crimes, prostitution, adultery, and illegitimacy carried heavy social and legal stigma. Magdalene laundries, institutions where fallen women were confined to forced labor, particularly in laundries. Social punishment, gossip, exclusion, and loss of reputation served as powerful non-legal punishments. For women, punishment was often about controlling sexuality and ensuring conformity to moral standards. Punishment in the British Empire. The empire relied on punishment to maintain control across its colonies. India, rebels during the 1857 uprising subjected to execution by cannon, a spectacle meant to terrify. Africa. Forced labor and corporal punishment used to extract resources and obedience. Australia, transportation continued into the mid-19th century, with convicts forming the backbone of colonial labor. Punishment abroad was not just legal, it was political, a way of making empire visible and feared. The Irish context, repression and punishment. Ireland, under British rule, saw especially harsh punishments. Political prisoners, imprisoned for nationalist agitation. Famine and workhouses, During the Great Famine, workhouses became overcrowded sites of suffering, blending poverty relief with punishment. Transportation: many Irish rebels were sent to Australia. Punishment in Ireland highlighted the intersection of politics, poverty, and empire. The use of shame as punishment. Victorians believed strongly in shame as a corrective force. Stocks and pillories: though declining, public humiliation lingered in rural communities. Social ostracism. Neighbors, churches, and employers enforced moral codes by exclusion. Religious reinforcement: sermons often portrayed crime as sin, with hellfire awaiting the disobedient. Punishment was thus internalized, with guilt and shame becoming lifelong burdens. Child punishment and juvenile justice. Children were treated as miniature adults under the law, until reformers pushed for change. Early system: children as young as 7 could be executed in the 18th century. By the 19th, executions of children were rare but still possible. Reform schools, established to discipline wayward children through strict routines and moral instruction. Industrial schools, trained poor children in labor to prevent delinquency. Punishment of children reflected Victorian efforts to balance compassion with strict control. The persistence of transportation. Though declining, transportation remained significant in the first half of the Victorian era. Australian colonies: thousands of convicts sent until the 1860s. Colonial society: transportation created entire penal communities, blending punishment with colonization. Legacy: convicts' descendants became part of the social fabric of Australia. Transportation revealed how punishment could shape nations. Reform movements. Not all Victorians approved of harsh punishments. Reformers sought more humane systems. Elizabeth Fry campaigned for better prison conditions, especially for women. John Howard advocated for hygiene, health, and fairness in prisons. Shift toward rehabilitation: reformers argued that crime was often linked to poverty, ignorance, or environment. By the late 19th century, punishment was increasingly framed as a means of reform, not just retribution. The age of empire and cultural punishment. Victorian punishment also extended to cultural suppression. Language bans: colonized peoples often forbidden to speak native languages in schools. Religious suppression. Missionaries replaced traditional practices with Christianity, punishing nonconformity. Economic penalties: heavy taxes enforced compliance and dependence. Empire punished not only bodies but identities. Closing reflection. The Victorian era was an age where punishment touched every layer of life, from the prison to the classroom, from the family home to the farthest corners of empire. It sought to discipline not just behavior but morality itself. For the poor, punishment meant the workhouse. For convicts, it meant endless treadmills or exile to the colonies. For women, it meant forced labor cloaked in morality. For colonized peoples, it meant subjugation on a massive scale. The Victorian obsession with morality and order ensured that punishment was everywhere, seen in the daily routines of the disciplined worker, the shamed woman, and the silent prisoner. It was an age where punishment became both harsher and more hidden, a paradox that would shape the modern penal system. Part 19: Punishments in the Early 20th Century and the World Wars. Introduction: A New Century of Justice and Violence. The dawn of the 20th century promised progress, reason, and reform. Yet punishment during this era was marked by a strange duality. While societies pursued modern prison reform and international law, they also unleashed unprecedented violence in global wars. The years between 1900 and 1945 reveal punishment in both its institutionalized reformist guise and its raw wartime brutality. Prison reform and the decline of public punishment. By the early 20th century, most Western nations had abandoned public executions. Prisons became central to justice. Focus on rehabilitation: reformatories emphasized education, vocational training, and psychological evaluation. Classification of prisoners: new systems separated inmates by gender, age, and offense. Criminology's rise. Theories of criminal psychology shaped punishment, focusing on character and environment rather than sin alone. Yet despite reformist language, prisons remained overcrowded and harsh. Juvenile justice and the new approach to children. The early 20th century saw a shift toward treating child offenders differently. Juvenile courts, established in the United States, Chicago, 1899, and soon replicated worldwide. Reform schools replaced harsh prison sentences, emphasizing discipline, work, and moral training. Child protection linked punishment to social welfare, recognizing neglect and poverty as drivers of crime. This marked a cultural turning point, where childhood innocence and reformability were prioritized. Capital punishment in the early 20th century. Though public executions had ended, the death penalty remained common. Hanging, still the primary method in Britain and much of Europe. Electrocution, adopted in the U.S. as a modern alternative, beginning in 1890 and continuing through the century. Firing squad, used in both civilian and military cases, especially in times of war. Executions became more clinical, framed as necessary rather than spectacular. World War I, military discipline and punishment. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, created a new dimension of punishment, mass military discipline. Desertion and cowardice, thousands of soldiers executed by firing squad, particularly in Britain, France, and Germany. Trench punishments, soldiers forced to endure humiliating tasks, confinement in field prisons, or physical labor. Shell shock misunderstood, soldiers suffering psychological trauma were sometimes punished as cowards rather than treated. Wartime justice was swift, often brutal, prioritizing discipline over fairness. Prisoners of war and international conventions. World War I was also a turning point for international law. Hague Conventions, 1899-1907. Set guidelines for the treatment of prisoners of war, POWs. Reality, conditions varied, some POWs endured forced labor, inadequate food, or mistreatment. Red Cross role emerged as a protector and inspector of POW camps. This period planted the seeds of modern international humanitarian law. The interwar years, authoritarian punishments. Between the wars, new authoritarian regimes reshaped punishment. Fascist Italy, Mussolini used imprisonment, exile, and execution to silence dissent. Nazi Germany built early concentration camps, Dachau, 1933, for political opponents, foreshadowing later horrors. Soviet Union, Stalin's Gulag system expanded, subjecting millions to forced labor in brutal camps. Punishment became explicitly political, a tool of state power. Corporal punishment and colonial control. In the colonies, corporal punishment persisted. Whipping and caning, standard tools of discipline in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Forced labor. Colonized peoples subjected to chain gangs, penal servitude, and exploitative plantation labor. Cultural suppression, language bans, religious restrictions, and collective punishments enforced obedience. Colonial punishment exposed the double standards of empires that preached civilization yet imposed brutality. World War II, the extremes of punishment. The Second World War, 1939 to 1945, brought punishment to catastrophic levels. Military tribunals, quick trials and executions for desertion, espionage, or resistance. Concentration camps, the Nazi regime institutionalized extermination, blending punishment with genocide. Japanese prison camps, POWs in Asia faced starvation, forced marches, and executions, e.g., Bataan Death March. Punishment in World War II blurred with atrocity, as states wielded terror as justice. Civilian punishments during war. Civilians also faced harsh punishments in occupied territories. Collective reprisals, entire villages destroyed in retaliation for resistance, e.g. Lidice in Czechoslovakia, Oradour-sur-Glane in France. Deportations, millions forcibly relocated, punished for ethnicity or political identity. Ration violations, civilians punished harshly for black market dealings, hoarding, or theft. Occupation blurred the line between law and domination. The Holocaust, punishment as ideology. Perhaps the most chilling example of punishment's perversion was the Holocaust. Criminalization of identity, Jews, Roma, homosexuals, and others punished not for acts but for existence. Camp hierarchy, prisoners punished with forced labor, starvation, beatings, and mass execution. Industrialized punishment, gas chambers turned death into bureaucratic process. The Holocaust represents punishment transformed into genocide, beyond crime, beyond justice, into ideology. The Nuremberg trials and international justice. After World War II, the world sought accountability. Nuremberg trials, 1945–46, tried Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. Legacy established the principle that individuals, not just states, are accountable. New precedent, following orders, no longer a defense. For the first time, punishment was global, extending beyond national courts. Punishments in the Soviet Gulag system. While Nuremberg prosecuted Nazi crimes, the Soviet Gulag continued. Scale, millions imprisoned for political dissent, petty theft, or arbitrary accusations. Conditions, harsh climates, forced labor in mines, forests, and railways. Punishment as control, the Gulag system reinforced fear, ensuring obedience under Stalin. The Gulag epitomized punishment as both repression and economic exploitation. Wartime justice in Asia. Punishment during World War II was not confined to Europe. Japanese Empire, civilians and POWs subjected to forced labor, beatings, and executions. China, the Sino-Japanese War saw mass atrocities, including the Nanjing Massacre. Post-war trials, the Tokyo Tribunal, 1946–48, prosecuted Japanese leaders for war crimes. Like Nuremberg, these trials sought to define justice on an international scale. Executions of collaborators. After World War II, many countries punished collaborators. France, thousands executed for collaboration with Nazi occupiers. Women accused of collaboration often publicly humiliated, their heads shaved. Eastern Europe, purges and trials targeted those who aided occupying forces. Symbolic punishment, these acts were as much about restoring national pride as dispensing justice. This period revealed how punishment served political healing as well as retribution. Shifts in attitudes toward corporal punishment. Even as war brought brutal punishments, peacetime societies debated reform. Abolitionist movements, growing voices called for the end of corporal punishment and the death penalty. Psychology and criminology increasingly emphasized rehabilitation and social factors in crime. International influence, the horrors of war spurred reflection on human rights and humane punishment. Punishment was at a crossroads, harsh in war, reformist in peace. Closing reflection. The first half of the 20th century was an age of extremes. Punishment oscillated between progressive reform and unimaginable brutality. In prisons and juvenile courts, nations experimented with rehabilitation. In battlefields and occupied lands, punishment was swift, merciless, and often unjust. In genocide and mass atrocity, punishment became ideology, destroying millions. In Nuremberg and Tokyo, humanity glimpsed the possibility of international justice. It was a century where punishment became both global and deeply personal, shaping lives in courtrooms, prisons, and concentration camps alike. Part 20, Punishments in the Modern and Contemporary Era, 1945–present. Introduction, From War to Rights. After the devastation of the world wars, society sought to redefine punishment in light of human rights, democracy, and international law. The modern era is marked by contradictions. While some countries embraced abolition, reform, and rehabilitation, others continued to apply harsh, retributive punishments. The Cold War and punishment as politics. The Cold War reshaped punishment globally. Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union expanded its Gulag until Stalin's death in 1953. Dissent was punished with imprisonment, psychiatric confinement, and exile. United States, punishment took a political dimension through McCarthyism, where accusations of communism led to blacklisting and ruined careers. Latin America, military dictatorships in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil used imprisonment, torture, and disappearances as political tools. Punishment became both a weapon of ideology and a means of control. The rise of human rights and international justice. The mid-20th century saw the codification of rights against inhumane punishment. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948 prohibited torture and cruel treatment. European Convention on Human Rights, 1950. Gave citizens recourse against state abuses. International Criminal Court, 2002 created permanent structures for prosecuting crimes against humanity. Punishment was no longer only a national matter, it became a global concern. Death penalty debates and abolition. The second half of the 20th century saw fierce debates over capital punishment. Europe, most nations abolished the death penalty by the late 20th century. United States, Supreme Court temporarily suspended it in Furman v. Georgia, 1972, before reinstating it in Gregg v. Georgia, 1976. Global divide. By the 21st century, about two-thirds of countries abolished it in law or practice, while others, including China, Iran, and the U.S., continued executions. The death penalty became a defining human rights issue. Prison expansion and mass incarceration. While some reforms emphasized rehabilitation, others produced mass incarceration. United States. From the 1970s onward, the prison population exploded due to the war on drugs, mandatory sentencing, and three strikes laws. Private prisons emerged as corporations profited from incarceration. Criticism: mass incarceration disproportionately affected minorities and the poor, sparking debates about systemic injustice. The modern prison became both a reformative institution and a symbol of inequality. Alternative sentences and restorative justice. Reform movements experimented with alternatives to prison. Probation and parole expanded as tools for reintegration. Community service, used for lesser offenses. Restorative justice, focused on dialogue between victim and offender, emphasizing healing over retribution. These approaches challenged traditional models of punishment, shifting the focus toward reconciliation. Punishment and mental health. Recognition of mental health transformed criminal justice. Insanity defense, reformulated to account for psychological conditions. Psychiatric prisons, specialized institutions for treatment rather than punishment. Critiques: some argued psychiatric incarceration was another form of control, echoing Michel Foucault's critiques of punishment and discipline. This reflected a broader trend of medicalizing deviance. Punishments in non-democratic states. Despite reforms in the West, authoritarian regimes maintained harsh punishments. China continued widespread use of the death penalty, re-education through labor, and political imprisonment. Middle East, some nations applied corporal punishments like flogging, amputation, and stoning under religious law. North Korea, punishment blended with absolute control, including forced labor camps and collective punishment of families. These systems stood in stark contrast to abolitionist movements elsewhere. Transitional justice, addressing past crimes. Post-conflict societies wrestled with how to punish atrocities. South Africa, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 1995 to 2002. Emphasized amnesty and forgiveness over retribution. Rwanda, Gacaca courts tried thousands of perpetrators of the 1994 genocide in community-based trials. Former Yugoslavia, international tribunals prosecuted war crimes from the Balkan Wars. These efforts highlighted new models of justice, hybrid systems of accountability and healing. Technology and surveillance as punishment. The digital age introduced new dimensions of control. Electronic monitoring, offenders tracked by ankle bracelets. Predictive policing, algorithms used to anticipate crime, raising concerns about bias. Surveillance states, nations like China deployed facial recognition and digital scoring systems to regulate behavior. Punishment increasingly blurred with surveillance and data control. Punishment in the Global South. In many parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, punishment combined colonial legacies with modern reforms. Corporal punishment, still legal in some regions, including schools. Prison conditions. Often overcrowded and underfunded. Death penalty, applied inconsistently, sometimes with political motives. Global inequality shaped the realities of punishment. Corporal punishment in decline. Over the 20th and 21st centuries, corporal punishment declined in legality. Schools, banned in most Western nations, though still practiced in parts of the US and Asia. Judicial use, nearly eliminated globally, though retained in some Islamic legal systems. Symbolic shift, societies increasingly saw corporal punishment as cruel, outdated, and counterproductive. This marked one of the clearest global reforms in punishment history. Contemporary human rights campaigns. Activists continue to push against inhumane punishments. Amnesty International, central in campaigning against the death penalty. Prison reform groups, expose solitary confinement, overcrowding, and abuse. UN involvement, promotes the Mandela Rules, 2015, setting international standards for humane treatment in prisons. These campaigns seek to universalize dignity within systems of justice. Solitary confinement and debate. One of the most contested modern punishments is solitary confinement. Widely employed in the U.S., often for disciplinary or security reasons. Criticism, prolonged isolation linked to severe psychological harm. Global debate, many argue it constitutes torture under international law. It represents the tension between security and human rights in punishment today. Punishment and terrorism. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw terrorism reshape punishment. Guantanamo Bay, symbol of indefinite detention and torture allegations. Extraordinary rendition, prisoners secretly transferred and interrogated abroad. Anti-terror laws, expanded state powers, often curtailing civil liberties. Terrorism blurred lines between justice, security, and punishment. Closing reflections, the future of punishment. Punishment in the modern world remains complex, contradictory, and contested. From retribution to rehabilitation, many nations lean toward reform, yet mass incarceration persists. From national to global, international justice continues to evolve, holding leaders accountable. From physical to digital, surveillance and predictive systems signal new forms of punishment. From cruelty to rights, human rights movements push for more humane systems, though challenges remain. The story of punishment is not finished, it is still unfolding, reflecting each society's struggle between justice, control, and compassion. That brings us to the end of this episode of Background Historian. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this episode, and comment what you'd like to see in the next installment. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your night, and sleep tight. Background Historian out.